The late Bronze Age Mediterranean world represented humanity's first truly international civilization, a complex web of interconnected palace economies that stretched from the Aegean Islands to the banks of the Euphrates. By 1450 BC, the major powers had established sophisticated systems of governance, trade, and diplomacy that would define the ancient world's most prosperous era. These civilizations operated through centralized palace complexes that controlled vast territories, managed elaborate bureaucracies, and maintained extensive diplomatic relations with their peers across the known world. The Mycenaean kingdoms of mainland Greece had emerged as the dominant force in the Aegean by this period, having absorbed and transformed the earlier Minoan civilization of Crete. The Mycenaean palaces at Pylos, Tiryns, Mycenae and Knossos operated as administrative centres controlling surrounding territories through a complex hierarchy of officials. The Wanax, or king, sat at the apex of this system, supported by the Lauagetas and a network of basileis who governed individual settlements. These palace economies managed everything from land tenure and livestock herds to craft production and religious ceremonies, creating detailed records in Linear B script that provide unprecedented insight into Bronze Age administration. Archaeological evidence from Pylos reveals the extraordinary complexity of these palace systems. The central megaron, with its circular hearth and throne room, served as both ceremonial centre and administrative hub. Surrounding this core were extensive storage areas containing massive pithoi filled with olive oil, wine and grain, while workshops housed specialised craftsmen producing textiles, metalwork and pottery. The palace controlled approximately 100,000 hectares of territory, managing over 400 settlements and maintaining detailed records of livestock herds numbering in the thousands of sheep, cattle and pigs. The Hittite Empire, centred in the Anatolian heartland around Hattusa, had reached its territorial zenith under Suppiluliuma I and his successors, controlling a vast domain stretching from the Black Sea coast to northern Syria. The Hittite administrative system combined indigenous Anatolian traditions with influences absorbed from conquered territories, creating a sophisticated imperial structure that managed diverse populations speaking dozens of languages. The great king ruled through a network of appointed governors and vassal rulers, while maintaining direct control over strategic regions through Hittite settlers and garrison towns. Hattusa itself exemplified Hittite imperial grandeur, with its massive stone fortifications enclosing an area of nearly 300 hectares. The city's upper section contained the royal citadel and temple complexes, while the lower town housed administrative buildings, workshops and residential quarters. The famous Lion Gate and King's Gate, decorated with relief sculptures of lions and warriors, demonstrated the empire's artistic achievements and military power. Within the citadel, the royal archives contained thousands of cuneiform tablets, recording treaties, legal codes, religious texts, and administrative documents that illuminate the empire's sophisticated governmental apparatus. New Kingdom Egypt had reached unprecedented heights of power and prosperity under the 18th and early 19th dynasties. The pharaohs of this period, including Amenhotep III, Akhenaten, Seti I, and Ramesses II, presided over an empire stretching from Nubia's gold mines to the Euphrates River. The Egyptian administrative system, refined over millennia, managed this vast domain through a complex bureaucracy of scribes, governors, and officials who maintained detailed records in hieroglyphic and hieratic scripts. Thebes served as the empire's religious capital, where the massive temple complexes of Karnak and Luxor demonstrated Egypt's architectural mastery and divine kingship ideology. The Valley of the Kings contained the elaborate tombs of New Kingdom pharaohs, filled with grave goods that showcased the period's artistic achievements and international connections. Memphis remained the administrative capital, while Pi-Ramesses in the Delta became a major royal residence and military base for campaigns in the Levant. These palace economies operated within an intricate web of trade networks that connected the Mediterranean world with distant regions across 3 continents. The bronze technology that defined this era required the combination of copper and tin, metals rarely found together naturally, necessitating long-distance trade relationships that spanned thousands of kilometres. Copper sources in Cyprus, Sardinia, and the Eastern Alps supplied the primary component, while tin deposits in Cornwall, Bohemia, and possibly Afghanistan provided the crucial alloying element. The Uluburun shipwreck, discovered off the Turkish coast and dating to approximately 1300 BC, provides extraordinary evidence of these trade networks' complexity. The vessel's cargo included 10 tons of Cypriot copper ingots, tin ingots likely from Afghanistan or Central Asia, glass ingots from Syria or Egypt, ebony logs from Africa, ivory tusks, ostrich eggshells, and luxury items from across the known world. Personal possessions of the crew and passengers included Mycenaean pottery, Canaanite jewellery, and a gold scarab bearing the name of Nefertiti, demonstrating the international character of Bronze Age maritime commerce. Lapis lazuli from Badakhshan in Afghanistan travelled through multiple intermediaries to reach Mediterranean workshops, where craftsmen fashioned it into jewellery, cylinder seals, and decorative inlays. This precious blue stone appeared in Tutankhamun's burial mask, Mycenaean palace frescoes, and Mesopotamian royal regalia, illustrating trade connections spanning over 5,000 kilometres. Similarly, amber from Baltic forests reached Egyptian and Mesopotamian courts through complex overland routes, while ivory from African elephants and Indian Ocean sources supplied workshops across the Mediterranean. The exchange of raw materials facilitated technological transfer and cultural interaction on an unprecedented scale. Bronze working techniques spread rapidly across trade networks, leading to regional innovations and specialised production centres. Cypriot smiths developed distinctive ingot shapes that became standard across the Mediterranean, while Mycenaean craftsmen created sophisticated bronze armour and weapons that influenced military technology throughout the region. Glassmaking technology, possibly originating in Mesopotamia, spread to Egypt and the Levant, where artisans developed new techniques for creating coloured glass and decorative objects. Diplomatic correspondence from this period reveals the sophisticated international relations that underpinned these trade networks. The Amarna letters, discovered at Akhenaten's capital of Amarna, comprise over 380 cuneiform tablets containing diplomatic correspondence between Egypt and other major powers during the 14th century BC. These letters, written primarily in Akkadian as the diplomatic lingua franca, provide unprecedented insight into Bronze Age international relations, revealing a world of formal protocols, gift exchange, and mutual recognition among peer rulers. The correspondence between Amenhotep III and Tushratta of Mitanni illustrates the personal nature of diplomatic relationships, with letters discussing royal marriages, gift exchanges, and mutual assistance. Tushratta's letters mention sending gold, lapis lazuli, and other precious materials to Egypt, while requesting Egyptian gold in return. The Babylonian king Kadashman-Enlil I complained to Amenhotep III about the quality of gold received, demanding pure metal rather than alloys, demonstrating the detailed nature of these diplomatic exchanges. Treaty relationships between major powers established formal frameworks for international cooperation and conflict resolution. The Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty, concluded between Ramesses II and Hattusili III around 1259 BC, represents one of history's first recorded international agreements. Preserved in both Egyptian hieroglyphic and Hittite cuneiform versions, the treaty established mutual defence obligations, extradition procedures for fugitives, and formal recognition of territorial boundaries. The treaty's detailed provisions reveal sophisticated legal thinking and diplomatic practice that would influence international relations for centuries. Marriage diplomacy played a crucial role in cementing these international relationships. Royal women regularly travelled between courts as diplomatic brides, bringing with them cultural influences, artistic traditions, and political connections. Amenhotep III married daughters of the Babylonian king Kurigalzu, and the Mitannian king Shutarna II, while Ramesses II married Hittite princesses to seal peace agreements. These marriages created lasting bonds between royal families and facilitated cultural exchange across political boundaries. Urban centres throughout the Late Bronze Age world reflected the prosperity and sophistication of palace economies. Mycenaean citadels like Tiryns featured massive cyclopean walls constructed from enormous limestone blocks, some weighing over 10 tons. The citadel's galleries and casemates provided storage space and defensive positions, while the palace complex included elaborate frescoed halls, bathing facilities and workshops. The famous Treasury of Atreus at Mycenae, with its corbelled dome reaching over 13 metres in height, demonstrated the engineering capabilities and artistic achievements of Mycenaean architects. Hittite cities combined defensive considerations with ceremonial grandeur. Hattusa's fortifications included sophisticated gate complexes with multiple chambers, sally ports and defensive towers. The city's rock sanctuary of Yazilikaya featured carved reliefs depicting the Hittite pantheon, while the Great Temple covered over 160 metres in length and contained numerous storage rooms filled with cult vessels and ceremonial objects. Regional centres like Carchemish and Aleppo maintained similar architectural programs, adapting Hittite imperial styles to local traditions. Egyptian cities reflected the kingdom's unique geographic and cultural characteristics. Thebes' temple complexes represented the pinnacle of New Kingdom architecture, with the hypostyle hall at Karnak containing 134 massive columns arranged in a forest of stone that created dramatic light and shadow effects. The temple's walls bore detailed reliefs depicting royal military campaigns, religious ceremonies, and divine interactions that served both decorative and propagandistic purposes. Memphis maintained its role as administrative capital, with extensive bureaucratic quarters and workshops producing goods for royal and religious use. Administrative systems across these civilizations employed sophisticated writing technologies adapted to local languages and needs. Linear B script used in Mycenaean palaces represented an early form of Greek written in syllabic characters borrowed and modified from Minoan Linear A. Palace scribes used this system to maintain detailed records of land tenure, livestock inventories, craft production, and religious obligations. The Pelus tablets record everything from individual sheep allocated to specific shepherds to complex land tenure arrangements involving religious officials and local communities. Hittite scribes employed cuneiform writing for multiple languages, including Hittite, Akkadian, Sumerian, and various Anatolian dialects. The royal archives at Hattusa contained international correspondence, legal codes, religious texts, and administrative documents that required scribes trained in multiple writing systems and languages. The Hittite legal code, preserved on numerous tablets, reveals sophisticated jurisprudence covering everything from property rights and family law to military service obligations and ritual requirements. Egyptian scribal schools trained administrators in hieroglyphic, hieratic, and demotic scripts, preparing them for careers in temple administration, provincial governance, and military service. The complexity of Egyptian writing, with its combination of logographic and alphabetic elements, required years of training and created a literate elite that formed the backbone of imperial administration. Scribal exercises preserved on ostraca and papyri reveal the educational curriculum that produced these skilled administrators. The sophisticated administrative machinery that had sustained late Bronze Age civilizations for over 2 centuries began showing signs of strain by 1250 BC, as environmental pressures and economic vulnerabilities exposed fundamental weaknesses in palace-controlled systems. Paleoclimatic evidence from across the eastern Mediterranean reveals a dramatic shift toward increased aridity and prolonged drought conditions that would challenge the agricultural foundations upon which these complex societies depended. Ice core data from Greenland and lake sediment cores from Anatolia indicate a significant cooling event around 1250 BC, followed by reduced precipitation levels that persisted for several decades. Tree ring chronologies from Anatolian juniper and oak specimens demonstrate markedly reduced growth rates beginning around 1250 BC, with some regions experiencing growth reductions of up to 40% compared to earlier periods. The Kızılırmak River basin, which supplied water to the Hittite heartland around Hattusa, shows evidence of dramatically reduced flow levels during this period, forcing agricultural communities to abandon marginal lands and concentrate in areas with more reliable water sources. Pollen analysis from lake sediments in central Anatolia reveals a shift from oak and deciduous forest vegetation to drought-resistant shrubland, indicating sustained environmental stress that would have severely impacted agricultural productivity. Similar environmental pressures affected the Mycenaean territories in Greece, where lake-level reconstructions from the Argolid Plain show significant drops in water tables during the late 13th century BC. The Kopais Basin in Boeotia, which had been successfully drained and cultivated by Mycenaean engineers, began experiencing flooding problems as reduced precipitation disrupted the delicate hydraulic systems that maintained agricultural land. Olive pollen counts from this period dropped significantly, suggesting that even drought-resistant crops struggled under the changing climatic conditions. The Egyptian Nile flood records, meticulously maintained by temple scribes, reveal increasing irregularity in annual inundations after 1250 BC. The Palermo Stone and other royal annals document several consecutive years of inadequate floods that forced the pharaonic administration to draw upon strategic grain reserves. Hieroglyphic inscriptions from the reign of Merneptah describe years of famine and administrative measures to redistribute grain from surplus regions to areas experiencing crop failures. The famous Israel Stele of Merneptah, while primarily commemorating military victories, also alludes to the agricultural difficulties that may have contributed to population movements and conflicts in the Levant. These climatic changes placed enormous stress on agricultural systems that had been optimized for the relatively stable conditions of the earlier Late Bronze Age. Mycenaean palace economies had developed sophisticated systems for managing agricultural surplus, with extensive storage facilities and redistribution networks that could normally handle seasonal variations and occasional poor harvests. However, the sustained nature of the environmental downturn overwhelmed these adaptive mechanisms, forcing administrators to make increasingly difficult choices about resource allocation. The Linear B tablets from Pylos reveal growing administrative concerns about livestock management during this period, with records showing dramatic reductions in sheep and cattle herds that had previously numbered in the thousands. Pastoral communities that had traditionally moved their flocks between highland summer pastures and lowland winter grazing found their traditional routes disrupted by drought conditions that reduced available fodder. The Knossos tablets document similar problems in Crete, where palace officials struggled to maintain the large flocks that had been essential to the island's textile industry. Palace-controlled economies had achieved remarkable prosperity through centralized management of production and distribution, but this same centralization created dangerous vulnerabilities when external pressures mounted. The Mycenaean administrative system depended upon a complex network of officials who collected agricultural surplus from rural communities and redistributed it according to palace priorities. This system worked effectively when agricultural production remained stable, but environmental stress exposed the dangers of concentrating economic control in palace bureaucracies that could not quickly adapt to changing conditions. The Hittite Empire faced similar challenges as drought conditions reduced agricultural productivity across its vast territories. Cuneiform tablets from Hattusa document increasing difficulties in maintaining the tribute obligations that vassal states owed to the imperial centre. Syrian provinces that had previously supplied grain, olive oil and other agricultural products to the Hittite court began requesting assistance rather than providing tribute. The Euphrates Valley, which had served as a crucial agricultural heartland for the empire, experienced reduced river flows that forced the abandonment of irrigation systems and agricultural settlements. International trade networks that had flourished during the late Bronze Age prosperity began experiencing severe disruptions as regional economies struggled with environmental pressures. The complex supply chains that brought tin from distant sources to Mediterranean bronze workshops became increasingly unreliable as political instability and economic difficulties affected intermediate trading partners. Copper production in Cyprus, while less dependent on climatic conditions than agriculture, faced new challenges as reduced agricultural surplus limited the ability of palace economies to purchase raw materials. The Uluburun shipwreck and similar archaeological evidence from this period shows changes in trade patterns that reflect growing economic stress. Cargo compositions become less diverse, with fewer luxury items and more emphasis on essential raw materials like copper and tin. The standardized ingot forms that had facilitated international trade began appearing in smaller sizes, suggesting that trading expeditions were operating with reduced capital and taking fewer risks on long-distance voyages. Population pressures intensified these economic difficulties as communities struggled to maintain themselves on reduced agricultural yields. Archaeological surveys across the eastern Mediterranean reveal evidence of settlement nucleation during this period, with smaller sites being abandoned as populations concentrated in larger, more defensible locations. The Argolid Plain in Greece shows a marked reduction in rural settlement sites after 1250 BC, with populations apparently moving to fortified centres like Tiryns and Mycenae that could provide better protection and access to stored resources. Competition for increasingly scarce resources led to widespread militarization as communities sought to protect their remaining assets and potentially acquire additional resources through force. Mycenaean sites from this period show extensive new fortification work, with massive cyclopean walls being extended and strengthened at major centres. Tiryns received particularly elaborate defensive improvements, including the construction of sophisticated galleries and casemates within the citadel walls that could shelter large numbers of people during sieges. The famous Lion Gate at Mycenae was reinforced during this period, with additional defensive works that narrowed the approach and created multiple choke points for attacking forces. Archaeological evidence suggests that these fortifications were not merely symbolic displays of power, but practical responses to real military threats. Arrowheads and other weapons appear more frequently in archaeological contexts from this period, while the remains of hastily constructed defensive walls at smaller sites indicate widespread concern about security. Hittite frontier regions experienced similar militarization as the empire struggled to maintain control over territories that were becoming increasingly difficult to govern effectively. The northern borders facing the Casca peoples required constant military attention, while Syrian vassals began asserting greater independence as the imperial centre's ability to project power declined. Fortification work at Hattusa itself intensified during this period, with new defensive walls and gate complexes designed to protect the royal citadel against potential threats. Egyptian military activities also intensified during this period, with Ramesses II and his successors mounting increasingly frequent campaigns in the Levant and Nubia. The famous Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites, while ultimately resulting in a peace treaty, demonstrated the growing military competition between major powers as they struggled to maintain access to resources and tribute. Egyptian fortress construction along the Nubian frontier increased significantly, with massive mud brick fortifications designed to protect gold mining operations and trade routes that had become essential to the pharaonic economy. Early signs of systemic stress became apparent in the archaeological record as palace economies began reducing expenditures on non-essential activities. Construction projects that had been hallmarks of late Bronze Age prosperity were scaled back or abandoned entirely. The massive building programs that had characterized earlier reigns gave way to more modest undertakings focused on essential defensive and administrative needs. At Pylos, construction work on the palace's northeastern wing appears to have been halted abruptly, with building materials left in place, as if work had stopped suddenly. Pottery production provides particularly clear evidence of economic stress during this period. The elaborate decorated ceramics that had characterised late Bronze Age artistic achievement gave way to simpler, more utilitarian forms that required less skilled labour and fewer resources to produce. Mycenaean pottery from context dating after 1250 BC shows reduced use of expensive pigments and simplified decorative schemes that suggest workshops were operating under economic constraints. The famous Mycenaean stirrup jars, which had served as standardised containers for olive oil export throughout the Mediterranean, begin appearing in smaller sizes and with less elaborate decoration. This change likely reflects both reduced olive oil production due to environmental stress and decreased demand from trading partners who are experiencing their own economic difficulties. Similar trends appear in other ceramic traditions across the Eastern Mediterranean, suggesting widespread economic pressures affecting craft production. Peripheral settlements that had flourished during the late Bronze Age expansion began experiencing abandonment as populations concentrated in core areas that could be more easily defended and supplied. The Mycenaean settlement at Nicosia in Messenia was abandoned during this period, along with numerous smaller sites throughout the Peloponnese. These abandonments represent more than simple population shifts. They indicate the breakdown of the extensive settlement networks that had characterized Mycenaean territorial control. Hittite provincial centers in marginal areas also experienced abandonment as the imperial administration concentrated resources on maintaining control over core territories. The elaborate administrative apparatus that had managed the empire's diverse populations and territories began contracting as officials were recalled to more secure positions closer to the imperial heartland. Cuneiform archives from this period show increasing gaps in provincial correspondence, suggesting that communication networks were breaking down under the pressure of environmental and economic stress. Administrative records from across the late Bronze Age world reveal growing difficulties in maintaining the complex bureaucratic systems that had enabled Palace control over vast territories and populations. The detailed inventories and land tenure records that had characterized earlier periods become less comprehensive, with officials apparently struggling to maintain accurate information about resources and obligations. Linear B tablets from the final phases of Mycenaean palace administration show evidence of hasty record keeping and simplified administrative procedures that suggest the system was operating under severe stress. The administrative crisis and environmental pressures that had begun destabilizing late Bronze Age civilizations created conditions that would give rise to one of history's most enigmatic and destructive forces. Against the backdrop of failing harvests and contracting palace economies, Egyptian scribes began recording encounters with maritime raiders whose origins, motivations, and ultimate destinations remained subjects of intense scholarly debate. These groups, collectively known to modern historians as the Sea Peoples, first appear in Egyptian records during the reign of Merneptah, around 1208 BC, described in hieroglyphic inscriptions as foreign warriors arriving by ship to challenge the established order of the Eastern Mediterranean world. The primary Egyptian sources for understanding these maritime raiders come from two major temple complexes, where pharaonic scribes recorded detailed accounts of military encounters and victory celebrations. The Karnak temple complex in Thebes preserves extensive hieroglyphic inscriptions from the reigns of Merneptah and Ramesses III that describe battles against various Sea Peoples groups, while the mortuary temple of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu contains the most comprehensive visual and textual documentation of these conflicts. These sources, while invaluable for understanding Egyptian perspectives on the Sea Peoples phenomenon, present significant interpretive challenges due to their propagandistic nature and the conventions of pharaonic military literature. The Karnak inscriptions of Merneptah describe the first major recorded encounter with Sea Peoples groups around 1208 BC, when these maritime raiders joined with Libyan forces in an assault on the western delta. The hieroglyphic texts identify several distinct groups participating in this coalition, including the Ekwesh, Teresh, Luka, Sherden, and Shekelesh. Egyptian scribes recorded these names phonetically, creating transliteration challenges that have generated extensive scholarly debate about the group's actual identities and origins. The Ekwesh have been tentatively identified with the Achaeans of Greek tradition, while the Luka appear to correspond with the Lycians of southwestern Anatolia. The Sherden, who had appeared in Egyptian records as early as the reign of Ramesses II, serving as mercenaries in the pharaonic army, are described in the Meneptah inscriptions as hostile raiders attacking Egyptian territory. This shift from mercenary service to aggressive raiding illustrates the complex and changing relationships between these maritime groups and established Bronze Age powers. The Shekelesh, possibly related to the Sicels of Sicily, are described as skilled seafarers whose ships threatened Egyptian coastal settlements and trade routes. The Medinet Habu reliefs and inscriptions, dating to the reign of Ramesses III around 1175 BC, provide the most detailed documentation of Sea People's activities and Egyptian responses to their raids. The temple's outer walls feature extensive carved reliefs depicting naval battles between Egyptian forces and Sea People's fleets, showing distinctive ship designs and warrior equipment that offer crucial insights into these groups' material culture and military organization. The accompanying hieroglyphic texts identify additional Sea Peoples groups, including the Peliset, Tieka, Danayan, and Vashesh, who joined the earlier raiders in what Egyptian sources describe as a coordinated assault on the Nile Delta. The Peliset, who would later settle in the southern Levantine coast and become known as the Philistines, are described in Egyptian sources as formidable warriors equipped with distinctive feathered headdresses, round shields, and long swords. The Medinet Habu reliefs show Peliset warriors fighting both on land and at sea, suggesting military versatility that enabled them to conduct complex amphibious operations. Their ships, depicted with distinctive birdhead prows and high sterns, appear designed for both warfare and long-distance travel, indicating sophisticated maritime technology adapted to Mediterranean conditions. The Tieka are described in Egyptian sources as skilled seafarers who established bases along the Levantine coast, while the Danaan may be connected with the Danaoi mentioned in Greek sources as early inhabitants of the Aegean region. The Vashesh remain among the most mysterious of the Sea Peoples groups, with their name appearing in Egyptian texts but leaving few other traces in the archaeological record. This diversity of names and apparent origins suggests that the Sea Peoples phenomenon encompassed multiple distinct populations rather than a single unified migration or invasion force. Archaeological evidence for population movements during this period comes from destruction layers at numerous sites across the eastern Mediterranean, though connecting these destructions directly to Sea Peoples' activities remains challenging. The site of Enkomi in Cyprus shows clear evidence of violent destruction around 1200 BC, with burned buildings and scattered bronze weapons suggesting sudden attack rather than gradual abandonment. Similar destruction layers appear at Ugarit on the Syrian coast, where cuneiform tablets found in the final destruction level describe urgent requests for military assistance against seaborne attackers. The debate between migration and invasion theories reflects fundamental disagreements about the nature of Sea Peoples' movements and their relationship to the broader Bronze Age collapse. Migration theorists argue that environmental pressures and political instability forced large populations to abandon their homelands and seek new territories, with violence occurring primarily when these displaced groups encountered resistance from established powers. This interpretation emphasizes the Sea Peoples as refugees or displaced populations rather than aggressive conquerors, suggesting that their raids represented desperate attempts to secure resources and territory rather than coordinated military campaigns. Invasion theorists, by contrast, argued that the Sea Peoples represented organized military forces that deliberately targeted wealthy Bronze Age centers for plunder and conquest. This interpretation emphasizes the military effectiveness demonstrated in Egyptian sources and the apparent coordination between different groups in attacking multiple targets simultaneously. The sophisticated naval technology and military equipment depicted in Egyptian reliefs suggest organised warrior societies rather than desperate refugee populations, supporting arguments for deliberate military aggression. Recent archaeological work has revealed evidence supporting elements of both interpretations, suggesting that the Sea Peoples phenomenon encompassed multiple types of population movement occurring simultaneously across different regions. Isotope analysis of human remains from sites associated with Sea Peoples activities indicates diverse geographical origins, with some individuals showing isotopic signatures consistent with Aegean origins, while others suggest Anatolian or Central Mediterranean backgrounds. This diversity supports theories of multiple population movements rather than a single coordinated migration or invasion. The possible origins of various Sea Peoples groups have generated extensive scholarly speculation based on linguistic analysis, archaeological evidence, and historical parallels. The Ekwesh are most commonly identified with displaced Mycenaean Greeks, possibly from the Peloponnese or Central Greece, where archaeological evidence shows widespread settlement abandonment during the late 13th century BC. The collapse of Mycenaean palace economies would have displaced large populations of warriors, craftsmen, and farmers who possessed the maritime skills and military technology necessary for successful raiding operations. The Luca appear to represent Anatolian populations from the southwestern coast, possibly displaced by Hittite political fragmentation or environmental pressures affecting traditional settlement areas. Hittite cuneiform sources from the 13th century BC describe increasing difficulties controlling Luca populations, who conducted raids against Hittite territories and allied with other hostile groups. The breakdown of Hittite imperial control may have freed these populations to pursue maritime raiding as an alternative to traditional agricultural and pastoral livelihoods. The Sherden have been tentatively connected with Sardinia, though this identification remains controversial due to limited archaeological evidence for Bronze Age Sardinian maritime capabilities. Alternative theories suggest origins in the central or eastern Mediterranean, possibly among displaced populations from regions experiencing political or environmental stress. Their documented service as Egyptian mercenaries before becoming hostile raiders suggests military experience and organisational capabilities that would have been valuable for conducting successful naval operations. Anatolian refugee populations provide another possible source for Sea Peoples groups, as the Hittite Empire's gradual fragmentation displaced numerous communities that had previously enjoyed imperial protection and economic support. The Danaan may represent displaced populations from the Adana region of southeastern Anatolia, where Hittite control had become increasingly tenuous during the late 13th century BC. These populations would have possessed knowledge of Bronze Age military technology and administrative systems that could have facilitated organised raiding activities. Central Mediterranean populations, including groups from Sicily, Sardinia, and the Italian peninsula, represent additional possible sources for Sea Peoples raiders. The Shekelesh have been connected with Sicily based on linguistic similarities, though archaeological evidence for large-scale population movements from the central Mediterranean remains limited. However, the sophisticated bronze-working traditions of these regions would have provided technological capabilities necessary for producing the weapons and equipment depicted in Egyptian sources. The early raiding activities of Sea Peoples groups focused initially on Cyprus and the Levantine coast, regions that offered attractive targets due to their wealth and strategic importance for Eastern Mediterranean trade networks. Cyprus had served as a crucial source of copper for Bronze Age civilizations, with sites like Enkomi and Kition functioning as major production and distribution centres for copper ingots that supplied workshops across the Mediterranean. The island's prosperity made it an obvious target for raiders seeking valuable resources, while its island location provided opportunities for surprise attacks and quick withdrawals. Archaeological evidence from Enkomi reveals the violent nature of these early raids, with destruction layers containing scattered bronze weapons, burned storage areas, and evidence of hasty abandonment. The site's copper workshops show signs of deliberate destruction, with furnaces smashed and tools scattered, suggesting that raiders specifically targeted the island's metallurgical capabilities. Similar destruction appears at other Cypriot sites, indicating coordinated attacks rather than isolated raids. The Levantine coast offered equally attractive targets for Sea People's raiders, with prosperous port cities like Ugarit serving as crucial nodes in international trade networks. Ugarit's destruction around 1200 BC left behind cuneiform tablets that provide contemporary documentation of the crisis, including urgent correspondence with other rulers requesting military assistance against seaborne attackers. The final tablet found in the city's archives describes ships of enemies approaching the coast, providing dramatic evidence of the city's final moments. The initial encounters between Sea People's groups and Egyptian forces under Meneptah occurred when these maritime raiders allied with Libyan tribes in an assault on the western delta around 1208 BC. Egyptian sources describe this as a coordinated attack involving both land and sea forces, with Libyan armies advancing overland while Sea People's fleets attacked Egyptian coastal positions. The hieroglyphic accounts emphasize the foreign nature of these attackers, describing their unfamiliar weapons, clothing, and fighting techniques. Meneptah's victory inscriptions at Karnak provide detailed casualty figures and descriptions of captured equipment that offer insights into Sea People's military capabilities. The texts record thousands of enemy dead and captured, along with seized weapons including bronze swords, spears, and shields of foreign manufacture. The emphasis on foreign weapon types suggests that Egyptian scribes recognized technological differences that distinguish Sea People's equipment from familiar regional traditions. The naval aspects of these early encounters reveal sophisticated maritime capabilities among Sea People's groups that enabled them to conduct complex amphibious operations. Egyptian relief shows Sea People's ships with distinctive design features, including high prows and sterns, suggesting vessels optimized for both warfare and long-distance travel. These ships appear capable of carrying substantial numbers of warriors along with their equipment, indicating organizational capabilities that supported coordinated military operations rather than simple raiding expeditions. The timing of these early raids coincides with a broader pattern of environmental and economic stress affecting late Bronze Age civilizations, suggesting that Sea People's activities represented responses to the same pressures that were destabilizing established palace economies. The combination of drought conditions, agricultural failures, and political fragmentation created opportunities for maritime raiders, while simultaneously providing motivations for displaced populations to seek new territories and resources through force. The Egyptian responses to these early encounters reveal both the seriousness of the threat and the continued military capabilities of New Kingdom forces. Meneptah's successful defense of the Delta required mobilizing substantial military resources, and demonstrated that established powers could still effectively resist Sea People's attacks when properly prepared and organized. However, the need for such extensive military efforts against relatively small raiding forces foreshadowed the greater challenges that would emerge as Sea People's activities intensified and expanded across the eastern Mediterranean. The weapons and equipment captured from defeated Sea People's forces provide archaeological evidence for the military technology and organizational capabilities of these maritime raiders. Bronze swords of distinctive design, including examples with reinforced tangs and elaborate hilts, suggest sophisticated metallurgical traditions that may indicate origins among established Bronze Age populations rather than peripheral societies. The presence of standardized weapon types across different Sea People's groups implies communication and coordination that supported unified military operations despite apparent diversity in origins and identities. The sophisticated administrative apparatus that had enabled the Hittite Empire to control vast territories stretching from the Black Sea to northern Syria began experiencing severe internal dysfunction following the death of Tudhaliya IV around 1237 BC. The succession crisis that erupted immediately after his death exposed fundamental weaknesses in the imperial structure that had been masked by the personal authority and military success of strong rulers. Unlike the well-established succession protocols of Egypt or the decentralized nature of Mycenaean kingdoms, the Hittite Empire depended heavily on the personal relationships between the great king and his network of governors, vassal rulers, and military commanders. The immediate aftermath of Tudhaliya IV's death witnessed competing claims to the throne that fragmented the imperial administration and diverted crucial resources from frontier defence and provincial governance. Anuanda III, the designated heir, faced immediate challenges from rival claimants who questioned both his legitimacy and his capability to maintain imperial unity. Cuneiform tablets from Hattusa reveal urgent correspondence between royal officials attempting to secure loyalty oaths from provincial governors, while simultaneously dealing with military threats on multiple frontiers. The royal archives document hasty appointments of new officials to replace those whose loyalty remained questionable, creating administrative chaos that undermined the empire's ability to respond effectively to external pressures. The succession dispute involved not merely questions of royal legitimacy, but fundamental disagreements about imperial policy and resource allocation. Some factions advocated for aggressive military campaigns to restore imperial prestige and secure tribute from rebellious vassals, while others argued for defensive consolidation to protect the Anatolian heartland from increasing external threats. These policy debates paralysed decision-making processes at crucial moments when rapid responses were essential for maintaining imperial control over distant territories. Provincial governors who had previously maintained loyalty to the imperial centre began asserting greater independence as the succession crisis weakened central authority. The governors of Syrian provinces, who had traditionally served as crucial intermediaries between the Hittite court and Levantine vassal states, found themselves increasingly isolated from imperial support while facing growing pressure from Assyrian expansion and Sea Peoples raids. Cuneiform correspondence from this period shows governors making independent military and diplomatic decisions that would previously have required explicit royal authorization. The civil war that erupted during Anuanda III's brief reign devastated the imperial military establishment and consumed resources that were desperately needed for frontier defence. Hittite military units that had previously been deployed against external enemies were recalled to participate in internal conflicts, leaving border regions vulnerable to attack from traditional enemies like the Kaska peoples and emerging threats from Assyrian expansion. The famous Hittite chariot forces, which had dominated Near Eastern battlefields for centuries, were divided between competing factions and suffered heavy casualties in internecine warfare that provided no strategic benefits for the empire. Archaeological evidence from Hattusa reveals the physical impact of this internal strife on the imperial capital itself. Destruction layers dating to this period show evidence of deliberate burning and vandalism within the royal citadel, suggesting that factional violence reached the heart of the imperial administration. Storage areas that had previously contained vast quantities of grain, olive oil, and other essential supplies were emptied or destroyed, undermining the capital's ability to withstand prolonged sieges or support large military forces. The famous royal archive suffered significant damage during this period, with thousands of cuneiform tablets scattered and broken, representing irreplaceable losses of administrative knowledge and diplomatic correspondence. The Assyrian expansion under Tukulti-Ninurta I posed an unprecedented challenge to Hittite control over eastern territories that had been integral to the empire's strategic and economic foundations. Unlike previous Assyrian rulers who had focused primarily on consolidating control over Mesopotamian territories, Tukulti-Ninurta I pursued an aggressive expansionist policy that directly threatened Hittite interests in northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia. His military campaigns combined traditional Assyrian siege warfare techniques with innovative tactical approaches that proved highly effective against Hittite defensive positions. The Assyrian military machine under Tukulti-Ninurta first represented a formidable challenge to Hittite supremacy in the region, employing iron weapons that provided significant advantages over traditional bronze equipment. Assyrian infantry units equipped with iron-tipped spears and swords could penetrate Hittite bronze armour more effectively, while Assyrian archers using iron arrowheads achieved greater range and penetration than their bronze-equipped opponents. The technological superiority of Assyrian forces was compounded by superior logistics and siege warfare capabilities that enabled sustained campaigns against fortified Hittite positions. The capture of Babylon by Tukulti-Ninurta, first around 1225 BC, demonstrated Assyrian military capabilities and sent shockwaves throughout the Near Eastern diplomatic community. The Babylonian kingdom had maintained complex treaty relationships with the Hittite Empire, and its sudden conquest by Assyrian forces revealed the inadequacy of traditional diplomatic arrangements in the face of aggressive military expansion. Hittite officials recognized that Assyrian success against Babylon foreshadowed similar threats to their own eastern provinces, but internal political chaos prevented effective countermeasures. The Euphrates Valley, which had served as a crucial buffer zone between Hittite and Assyrian spheres of influence, became a contested frontier where both empires struggled for control over strategic crossing points and agricultural resources. Assyrian forces established fortified positions along the eastern bank of the Euphrates, threatening traditional Hittite supply routes and communication lines with Syrian vassals. The loss of secure access to these territories undermined the empire's ability to collect tribute and maintain political control over regions that had been integral to imperial finances. Hittite attempts to counter Assyrian expansion were hampered by the simultaneous need to address threats from other directions, particularly the intensifying Casca raids from the northern mountains. The Casca peoples, who had been persistent enemies of the Hittite Empire throughout its history, recognized the empire's internal weaknesses and launched increasingly ambitious attacks against Anatolian settlements. Unlike their previous hit-and-run tactics, Casca forces began conducting sustained campaigns that aimed to capture and hold Hittite territory rather than simply raid for plunder. The mountainous terrain of northern Anatolia provided ideal conditions for Casca warfare, with dense forests and rugged topography that favoured their traditional guerrilla tactics, while negating Hittite advantages in chariot warfare and siege technology. Casca warriors, equipped with bronze weapons and intimate knowledge of local terrain, could strike rapidly against Hittite settlements and withdraw into mountain strongholds before imperial forces could respond effectively. Their raids targeted not only military installations, but also agricultural settlements, livestock herds, and mining operations that were essential to the imperial economy. The loss of control over northern Anatolia had cascading effects on the empire's strategic position and economic foundations. Copper mines in the Pontic Mountains, which had supplied essential raw materials for Hittite bronze production, fell under Casca control or were abandoned due to security concerns. The disruption of mining operations created shortages of copper that affected weapon production and forced the imperial administration to rely increasingly on imports from distant sources like Cyprus, which were themselves becoming unreliable due to Sea People's activities. Agricultural settlements in the northern provinces, which had provided grain surplus for the imperial capital and military forces, were systematically destroyed or abandoned as Casca raids made farming impossible in exposed locations. The Kızılırmak River Valley, traditionally one of the empire's most productive agricultural regions, experienced widespread depopulation as farming communities fled southward to seek protection in fortified centres. This population movement strained resources in the remaining controlled territories while reducing the agricultural base that supported the imperial economy. The psychological impact of Casca successes extended far beyond the immediate territorial losses, undermining confidence in imperial military capabilities and encouraging other enemies to increase their aggressive activities. Provincial governors who'd previously relied on imperial military support began making independent arrangements with local strongmen and tribal leaders, effectively fragmenting the empire into autonomous regions that maintained only nominal loyalty to the great king. The carefully constructed hierarchy of imperial administration began dissolving as local officials prioritized immediate survival over imperial obligations. Hittite military responses to the Casca threat revealed the empire's declining military effectiveness and strategic confusion. Traditional tactics that had proven successful in earlier periods proved inadequate against enemies who avoided direct confrontation and exploited the empire's overextended defensive commitments. Attempts to establish fortified frontier zones required enormous resources that were not available due to internal political chaos and competing military priorities. The famous Hittite chariot forces, designed for open battlefield warfare, proved largely useless in the mountainous terrain where Casca forces operated most effectively. The reign of Anuanda III, lasting only a few years in the early 1220s BC, demonstrated the empire's inability to address multiple simultaneous crises through traditional imperial mechanisms. His attempts to restore central authority through military campaigns and administrative reforms were undermined by continued factional opposition and the practical impossibility of projecting effective military power across the empire's vast territories. Cuneiform records from his reign show increasingly desperate attempts to secure military assistance from remaining loyal provinces, while simultaneously trying to negotiate truces with the various enemies. The succession of Suppiluliuma II around 1207 BC marked the final attempt to restore Hittite imperial power through aggressive military action and administrative reorganisation. Unlike his predecessors who had focused primarily on defensive measures, Suppiluliuma II pursued an ambitious strategy that aimed to restore imperial prestige through successful military campaigns, while simultaneously reforming the administrative apparatus that had proven inadequate for managing imperial crises. His early campaigns achieved some tactical successes that temporarily stabilized certain frontier regions, but these victories proved insufficient to address the fundamental structural problems that were undermining imperial effectiveness. Archaeological evidence from Hattusa during Suppiluliuma II's reign reveals extensive construction projects aimed at strengthening the capital's defences and demonstrating imperial power. New fortification walls were constructed around previously undefended areas of the city, while existing defensive works were reinforced with additional towers and gates designed to withstand prolonged sieges. The royal citadel received particular attention, with new storage facilities and defensive positions that suggest preparations for extended resistance against potential attackers. The final cuneiform archives from Hattusa provide dramatic evidence of the empire's last desperate attempts to maintain control over its remaining territories. Correspondence with provincial governors reveals increasingly urgent requests for military assistance and tribute payments, while diplomatic letters with foreign rulers show attempts to secure military alliances against common enemies. The administrative records document hasty mobilization of remaining imperial resources, including the melting down of ceremonial bronze objects to produce weapons and the conscription of previously exempt populations for military service. The sudden disappearance of cuneiform records from Hattusa around 1180 BC marks the dramatic end of the Hittite Empire's administrative apparatus. Unlike the gradual decline evident in other Bronze Age civilizations, the Hittite collapse appears to have been remarkably rapid and complete. Archaeological evidence suggests that the imperial capital was abandoned suddenly, with valuable objects left in place and administrative archives scattered as if officials had fled without time for organised evacuation. The great temple complexes and royal palaces that had symbolised imperial power for centuries were left empty, their massive stone foundations serving as monuments to a vanished civilization. The final destruction of Hattusa shows clear evidence of deliberate burning and systematic demolition that suggests coordinated enemy action rather than simple abandonment. Storage areas were emptied and burned, defensive walls were partially dismantled, and royal buildings were stripped of valuable materials, including bronze fittings, decorative objects, and ceremonial weapons. The scale and thoroughness of this destruction indicates that the Empire's enemies possessed sufficient organisation and resources to conduct sustained operations against the imperial heartland itself. The identity of the forces responsible for Hattusa's final destruction remains uncertain, though the evidence suggests a combination of external enemies and internal rebellion rather than a single attacking force. Casca peoples from the north may have joined with rebellious provincial populations and possibly Sea Peoples raiders in a coordinated assault that overwhelmed the empire's remaining defensive capabilities. The rapid and complete nature of the collapse suggests that imperial resistance had been so thoroughly undermined by previous crises that organised defence proved impossible when the final assault began. The administrative collapse that had devastated the Hittite Empire found its parallel in mainland Greece, where the sophisticated palace economies of Mycenaean civilization faced an equally dramatic but more gradual disintegration. Unlike the sudden abandonment of Hattusa, the Mycenaean centres experienced a prolonged period of decline that stretched across nearly 2 centuries, marked by sequential destructions, administrative breakdown, and the eventual abandonment of the complex bureaucratic systems that had defined late Bronze Age Greek civilization. The process began with localized destructions around 1250 BC and culminated in the complete collapse of palatial administration by 1100 BC, leaving behind a transformed landscape where small, isolated communities struggled to maintain basic subsistence in the ruins of their former grandeur. The destruction of Pylos around 1200 BC provides the most dramatic and well-documented example of Mycenaean palatial collapse, preserved in archaeological detail that reveals both the violence of the event and the sophisticated administrative system that perished in the flames. The palace complex, which had served as the administrative centre for the kingdom of Nestor, was consumed by a massive fire that baked thousands of Linear B tablets into permanent ceramic records of the civilization's final moments. These tablets, discovered in their original archive rooms, document the palace's desperate final attempts to organize military defense and manage dwindling resources as external threats mounted. The Linear B tablets from Pylos's final destruction level reveal a palace administration under severe stress, with records showing frantic attempts to mobilize military forces and secure coastal defences against seaborne attackers. Tablet. And 657 records the deployment of rowers to coastal watch stations, while other tablets document the distribution of bronze weapons and the organisation of military units from various districts within the kingdom. The administrative terminology used in these final records differs markedly from earlier periods, with new military titles and emergency procedures that suggest the palace bureaucracy was adapting rapidly to unprecedented threats. Archaeological evidence from the palace destruction shows that the fire burned with sufficient intensity to melt bronze objects and collapse stone walls, indicating either deliberate arson or the use of incendiary weapons by attackers. The Megaron's central hearth area contained a thick layer of ash, mixed with melted bronze artefacts, while storage rooms yielded charred remains of olive oil containers that had fed the flames. Human skeletal remains found in several palace rooms show evidence of violent death, with bronze arrowheads and spear points embedded in bone, providing direct evidence of armed conflict during the palace's final hours. The systematic nature of Pylos's destruction suggests coordinated enemy action rather than accidental fire or internal conflict. Storage areas containing the palace's accumulated wealth were thoroughly ransacked, with bronze vessels, jewellery and other valuable objects either removed or deliberately destroyed. The palace workshops, which had produced fine pottery, textiles and metalwork for local use and export, were systematically demolished with their equipment scattered and broken. Even the palace's religious areas were not spared, with cult objects smashed and sacred storage areas burned, indicating that the attackers showed no respect for traditional religious sanctities. The destruction of Tiryns followed a different pattern that reveals the varied nature of threats facing Mycenaean centres during this period. Unlike Pylos's sudden violent end, Tiryns experienced a series of destructions and rebuilding efforts that demonstrate the palace's attempts to adapt to changing circumstances through architectural modifications and defensive improvements. The massive Cyclopean walls that had protected the citadel were extended and reinforced during the 13th century BC, with new galleries and casemates constructed to provide additional storage space and defensive positions for the palace's reduced population. Archaeological investigation of Tiryns' destruction levels reveals evidence of multiple burning episodes separated by periods of reconstruction and continued occupation. The lower citadel shows clear evidence of destruction around 1200 BC, with burned buildings and scattered pottery indicating violent conflict, but the upper citadel continued to function as a reduced administrative centre for several more decades. This pattern suggests that Tiryns' rulers successfully defended their core stronghold while losing control over surrounding territories and populations. The final destruction of Tiryns around 1150 BC left behind evidence of a much reduced community that had abandoned most of the citadel's original functions while maintaining basic defensive capabilities. The Great Megaron, which had served as the ceremonial and administrative heart of the palace complex, was divided into smaller rooms that housed craft activities and storage rather than royal ceremonies. Pottery from this final period shows dramatic changes in style and quality, with local handmade ceramics replacing the fine wheel-made pottery that had characterized earlier palatial production. Mycenae itself, the legendary stronghold of Agamemnon and the most powerful of the Mycenaean centres, experienced a complex sequence of destructions and modifications that illustrate the gradual nature of palatial decline. The famous Lion Gate and Cyclopean walls remained intact throughout this period, but the palace complex within the citadel underwent significant changes that reflect both defensive concerns and reduced administrative capabilities. Archaeological evidence shows that the original palace was partially destroyed around 1200 BC, then rebuilt on a smaller scale with simplified architectural features that required less skilled labour and fewer resources to maintain. The treasury of Atreus and other monumental Tholos tombs around Mycenae continued to receive burials during the early phases of decline, but the grave goods deposited with these interments show marked changes in both quantity and quality compared to earlier periods. Bronze weapons and jewellery become less elaborate, while imported luxury items virtually disappear from burial contexts. This pattern suggests that Mycenae's ruling elite maintained their social positions and burial traditions, even as their actual wealth and political power diminished significantly. The breakdown of linear B administration represents one of the most significant cultural losses accompanying Mycenaean decline, as the sophisticated writing system that had enabled palace control over vast territories and complex economies disappeared entirely from the archaeological record after 1100 BC. The Linear B script, which had been adapted specifically for recording the Greek language in syllabic form, required extensive scribal training and was closely tied to the administrative needs of palace bureaucracies. When these bureaucracies collapsed, the practical need for writing disappeared, and the knowledge necessary to maintain the script was lost within a single generation. The final Linear B tablets from various Mycenaean sites reveal the increasing simplification of administrative procedures as palace bureaucracies struggled to maintain basic functions with reduced personnel and resources. Record-keeping systems that had previously tracked thousands of individual livestock, complex land tenure arrangements, and elaborate craft production quotas were reduced to simple inventories of essential military equipment and basic food supplies. The sophisticated terminology that had characterized earlier administrative documents gave way to simplified vocabulary and abbreviated recording procedures that suggest scribes were operating under severe time and resource constraints. The loss of literacy in mainland Greece represents more than simply the disappearance of a writing system. It indicates the complete breakdown of the complex administrative apparatus that had enabled Mycenaean civilization to achieve its remarkable prosperity and territorial control. Without written records, palace officials could no longer maintain the detailed inventories and land tenure documents that had been essential for managing large-scale agricultural operations and craft production. The intricate systems of tribute collection, resource redistribution, and territorial administration that had characterized Mycenaean governance became impossible to maintain without the bureaucratic infrastructure that Linear B documentation had supported. Population decline across Mycenaean territories accompanied the collapse of palatial administration, with archaeological surveys revealing widespread settlement abandonment during the 12th and 11th centuries BC. The Argolid Plain, which had supported dense rural populations during the height of Mycenaean prosperity, shows dramatic reductions in settlement numbers, with most smaller sites abandoned entirely while populations concentrated in a few defensible locations. Similar patterns appear throughout the Peloponnese, where extensive Mycenaean settlement networks contracted to isolated strongholds that maintained only local control over their immediate surroundings. The abandonment of rural settlements reflects the breakdown of the security and economic systems that had enabled dispersed agricultural communities to flourish under palatial protection. Without palace-sponsored defence forces and redistribution networks, farming communities became vulnerable to raiders and could no longer rely on external support during periods of poor harvests or local conflicts. The concentration of populations in fortified centres represents a defensive adaptation that sacrificed agricultural productivity for security, contributing to the overall economic decline that characterised the post-palatial period. Settlement patterns during the late Helladic 33C period reveal attempts by surviving communities to maintain defensive capabilities while adapting to reduced resources and populations. Many sites show evidence of hastily constructed defensive walls built from reused stones taken from earlier monumental buildings, indicating that communities were cannibalizing their architectural heritage to create practical fortifications. These defensive works, while effective for local protection, lack the sophisticated engineering and massive scale that had characterized earlier Mycenaean fortifications, reflecting both reduced construction capabilities and more limited territorial ambitions. The shift from complex palace economies to subsistence-based agriculture represents one of the most fundamental changes accompanying Mycenaean decline. The sophisticated systems of craft specialization, long-distance trade, and resource redistribution that had characterized palatial administration gave way to local production focused on meeting immediate survival needs. Archaeological evidence shows the virtual disappearance of specialized craft workshops, with pottery production shifting from palace-controlled facilities using potter's wheels to household-based, handmade ceramics that served purely utilitarian functions. Agricultural practices also underwent significant simplification during this period, with evidence suggesting that communities abandoned the intensive cultivation techniques and large-scale livestock management that had characterized palatial agriculture. The complex systems of land tenure and agricultural administration, documented in Linear B tablets, were replaced by simpler arrangements that emphasized immediate food production over surplus generation for trade or tribute. Olive oil and wine production, which had been major export industries during the palatial period, declined dramatically as communities focused on growing grain and other staple crops necessary for basic subsistence. The transformation of pottery styles during the late Helladic 33C period provides crucial evidence for understanding cultural continuity and change during Mycenaean decline. While the collapse of palatial administration eliminated the fine, wheel-made ceramics that had characterized earlier periods, pottery production continued in modified forms that maintained certain traditional decorative elements while adapting to new production methods and functional requirements. The distinctive stirrup jars that had served as standardized containers for olive oil export were replaced by simpler storage vessels, but decorative motifs like spirals, birds, and geometric patterns continued to appear on handmade pottery. Regional variations in late Helladic 33C pottery styles suggest that different areas developed distinct cultural traditions as the unifying influence of palatial administration disappeared. The Argolid maintained closer connections to earlier Mycenaean decorative traditions, while areas like Achaea and the Western Peloponnese developed more innovative ceramic styles that incorporated new motifs and shapes. These regional differences reflect the fragmentation of Mycenaean cultural unity and the emergence of localized traditions that would influence later Greek cultural development. Burial practices during the decline period reveal both continuity with earlier traditions and adaptations to changed circumstances. Chamber tombs, which had been the standard burial form for Mycenaean elites, continued to be used in some areas, but the grave goods deposited with burials show dramatic changes in both quantity and character. Bronze weapons and jewellery become much simpler and less elaborate, while imported luxury items virtually disappear from burial contexts. This pattern suggests that social hierarchies persisted even as the material wealth that had supported elite lifestyles diminished significantly. The appearance of new burial forms during late Helladic 3C, including simple pit graves and cremation burials, indicates cultural changes that may reflect population movements or the adoption of new religious practices. Cremation, which had been rare during the glacial period, becomes more common in some regions, possibly indicating influence from populations originating outside traditional Mycenaean territories. These changes in mortuary practices reflect broader cultural transformations that accompanied the political and economic collapse of glacial civilization. Religious practices also underwent significant modifications during the decline period, with evidence suggesting that the elaborate state cults that had characterized glacial religion were replaced by simpler local traditions. The great temple complexes that had served as centers for palace-sponsored religious activities were abandoned or converted to other uses, while religious observance shifted to smaller shrine areas that served local community needs. Archaeological evidence from sites like Tiryns shows the construction of simple altars and cult areas within domestic contexts, indicating that religious practice became more privatized and less centrally organized. The survival of certain religious symbols and practices despite the collapse of palatial institutions demonstrates the deep cultural roots of Mycenaean religious traditions. Double axes, snake goddesses, and other religious motifs continue to appear in late Helladic 3C contexts, suggesting that core religious concepts persisted even as their institutional framework disappeared. This religious continuity provided important cultural stability during a period of dramatic political and economic transformation, helping communities maintain cultural identity despite the loss of their traditional political structures. The scattered raids and opportunistic attacks that had characterized the early Sea People's activities transformed dramatically around 1200 BC into coordinated military campaigns that demonstrated unprecedented organizational capabilities and strategic planning. The mortuary temple of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu preserves the most comprehensive visual documentation of these intensified conflicts, with massive stone reliefs covering the temple's outer walls that depict both land and naval battles between Egyptian forces and Sea People's coalitions. These carved scenes, executed by skilled Egyptian artisans under royal supervision, provide extraordinary detail about the weapons, ships, tactics, and appearance of the maritime raiders who threatened the established order of the Eastern Mediterranean world. The land battle reliefs at Medinet Habu show Egyptian infantry and chariot forces engaging Sea People's warriors in formal battlefield encounters that contrast sharply with the hit-and-run tactics of earlier raids. The Sea People's fighters depicted in these scenes wear distinctive feathered headdresses, short kilts, and bronze corselets that protected their torsos while allowing freedom of movement. Their round shields, held by central grips, appear designed for close combat rather than the long-range archery exchanges that had characterized much Bronze Age warfare. The relief carvers paid careful attention to depicting the foreigners' weapons, showing long straight swords, bronze-tipped spears, and distinctive helmets with projecting crests that differed markedly from traditional Egyptian military equipment. The Egyptian forces shown in these same reliefs demonstrate the New Kingdom military machine at its organizational peak, with disciplined formations of infantry carrying standardized weapons and equipment. Egyptian archers, positioned behind protective pavises, launch volleys of arrows at advancing Sea People's formations, while chariot squadrons maneuver to attack enemy flanks and rear areas. The pharaoh himself appears in his war chariot, drawing his composite bow while his horses trample fallen enemies, following the conventional artistic program that emphasised royal military prowess and divine protection. The naval battle scenes at Medinet Habu provide even more detailed information about Sea People's maritime capabilities and Egyptian naval responses. The foreign ships depicted in these reliefs feature distinctive design characteristics, including high prows and sterns decorated with bird heads, square-rigged sails, and rowing positions for substantial crews. These vessels appear purpose-built for warfare, with elevated fighting platforms and reinforced construction that could withstand the ramming tactics shown in the relief scenes. The Egyptian ships, by contrast, display the traditional riverine design characteristics adapted for Nile navigation, with lower profiles and different rigging arrangements that reflected their primary function as transport vessels rather than purpose-built warships. The relief scenes show the actual mechanics of ancient naval combat, with Egyptian and Sea People's vessels locked together as warriors fight hand-to-hand across the gunwales. Egyptian marines use their superior archery skills to devastating effect, launching arrows at close range into crowded enemy ships, while Sea People's fighters attempt to board Egyptian vessels with their characteristic longswords and spears. The artistic program emphasizes Egyptian tactical superiority, showing pharaonic forces using coordinated archery and ramming attacks to overcome Sea People's numerical advantages and maritime expertise. Archaeological evidence from destruction levels across the Levant provides compelling support for the coordinated nature of these attacks, with multiple major sites showing simultaneous destruction around 1200 BC that suggests carefully planned military campaigns rather than opportunistic raiding. Ugarit, the great cosmopolitan port city that had served as a crucial node in international trade networks, suffered complete destruction that left the site permanently abandoned. The final destruction level contains scattered cuneiform tablets that provide contemporary documentation of the crisis, including urgent correspondence with other rulers requesting immediate military assistance against seaborne attackers approaching the coast. The last tablet found in Ugarit's royal archives, discovered exactly where it fell when the palace burned, records a desperate message describing enemy ships visible on the horizon and requesting immediate reinforcement from allied cities. The tablet's abrupt ending suggests that the scribe was forced to abandon his work as attackers entered the palace complex, providing dramatic evidence of the speed and violence of the city's final destruction. Other tablets from the same context document hasty attempts to organise coastal defences and evacuate valuable archives, revealing a community that recognised the mortal danger but lacked sufficient time or resources to mount effective resistance. The archaeological remains of Ugarit's destruction show systematic demolition that extended far beyond simple military conquest to include deliberate destruction of the city's economic and cultural infrastructure. The palace complex was thoroughly burned, with storage areas containing thousands of cuneiform tablets reduced to ash and scattered fragments. The city's harbour installations were systematically destroyed, with stone quays broken up and harbour facilities filled with rubble that made future use impossible. Even residential areas received similar treatment, with houses burned and their contents scattered in patterns that suggest deliberate vandalism rather than simple looting. Alalak, located in the Amuk plain of southeastern Anatolia, experienced destruction that followed remarkably similar patterns to Ugarit, despite the site's geographical separation and different political affiliations. The final destruction level at Alalak contains evidence of massive fires that consumed the palace complex and surrounding administrative buildings, while scattered weapons and human skeletal remains indicate violent resistance to attacking forces. The systematic nature of the destruction, with storage areas emptied and administrative buildings deliberately burned, suggests that the attackers possessed detailed knowledge of the site's layout and strategic importance. The timing of destructions at Ugarit, Alalak and other Levantine sites provides crucial evidence for the coordinated nature of these attacks. Radiocarbon dating and ceramic chronology indicate that these destructions occurred within a narrow time frame around 1200 BC, suggesting synchronized military operations rather than sequential attacks spread over several years. This temporal clustering implies sophisticated planning and communication capabilities among attacking forces that enabled them to coordinate simultaneous assaults across hundreds of kilometers of territory. Tel Twine, the harbour town that served Ugarit's maritime commerce, shows destruction patterns identical to the main city, with burned buildings and scattered artefacts indicating sudden, violent attack. The site's strategic location controlling access to Ugarit's inland territories made it a logical target for seaborne raiders, but the thoroughness of its destruction suggests that attackers understood its economic importance and deliberately eliminated its capacity to support future recovery. Similar destruction appears at other coastal sites throughout the Levant, indicating systematic targeting of maritime infrastructure that supported international trade networks. The role of new military technologies in these coordinated attacks remains a subject of intense scholarly debate, though the archaeological evidence clearly demonstrates that iron weapons had not yet achieved widespread adoption during this crucial period. Bronze remained the dominant material for weapons and tools throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, with iron technology still in its early developmental stages and limited to small-scale production of specialized items. However, innovations in bronze working techniques and tactical applications may have provided attacking forces with significant advantages over defenders who relied on traditional military equipment and methods. Analysis of bronze weapons recovered from destruction contexts reveals sophisticated metallurgical techniques that produce superior cutting edges and more durable construction than earlier Bronze Age weapons. Swords found at destroyed sites show evidence of advanced forging methods, including differential hardening and composite construction that created blades with hard cutting edges and flexible cores. These technological improvements would have provided significant advantages in close combat, enabling attackers to penetrate traditional bronze armour and shields more effectively than earlier weapon designs. The appearance of new weapon types in destruction contexts suggests tactical innovations that complemented technological advances in creating more effective military systems. Long straight swords, designed for thrusting rather than slashing attacks, appear frequently in archaeological contexts associated with Sea People's activities. These weapons, optimized for penetrating armour and fighting in close formation, represent significant departures from the curved, slashing swords that had characterized earlier Bronze Age warfare. Their effectiveness in siege warfare and urban combat may have contributed to the rapid success of attacks against fortified positions. Spear points recovered from destruction levels show similar technological innovations, with reinforced sockets and improved hafting techniques that created more durable weapons capable of withstanding the stresses of prolonged combat. Some examples feature barbed points designed to inflict maximum damage and prevent easier removal from wounds, suggesting military traditions that emphasize killing efficiency over the capture of prisoners for ransom or slavery. These weapon characteristics align with the archaeological evidence for systematic destruction rather than simple conquest and occupation. Defensive innovations appear in archaeological contexts from sites that successfully resisted attack, revealing attempts by established powers to counter new military technologies and tactics. Fortification walls at sites like Carchemish show hasty modifications, including the addition of projecting towers and gate complexes, designed to provide overlapping fields of fire against attacking forces. These architectural changes suggest that defenders recognized the inadequacy of traditional fortifications against new siege techniques and attempted to adapt their defensive systems accordingly. The systematic destruction of storage facilities and administrative centers reveals strategic thinking that went beyond simple military conquest to include deliberate elimination of the economic and political infrastructure that supported Bronze Age civilization. Attackers consistently targeted palace complexes, temple treasuries, and warehouse districts that contained the accumulated wealth and administrative records necessary for governmental function. This pattern suggests that the attacking forces understood the centralized nature of Bronze Age political systems and deliberately sought to prevent recovery by destroying the institutional framework that enabled palace control over territories and populations. Destruction layers at multiple sites contain evidence of deliberate burning using accelerants that created fires hot enough to melt bronze objects and collapse stone walls. The presence of olive oil residues and other flammable materials in destruction contexts indicates that attackers systematically used stored commodities to fuel destructive fires that consumed entire building complexes. This technique required detailed knowledge of storage locations and building layouts that suggests either extensive reconnaissance or assistance from local populations familiar with target sites. The treatment of religious installations during these attacks reveals attitudes toward traditional Bronze Age religious practices that differed markedly from earlier military campaigns. Temple complexes at destroyed sites show evidence of systematic desecration, with cult statues smashed, sacred vessels broken, and religious archives deliberately destroyed. This pattern contrasts sharply with traditional Bronze Age warfare, where victorious armies typically incorporated conquered deities into their own religious systems, rather than destroying them entirely. The systematic nature of religious destruction suggests ideological motivations that went beyond a simple military conquest. Human skeletal remains from destruction contexts provide disturbing evidence of the violence that accompanied these coordinated attacks. Mass burial pits at several sites contain the remains of men, women, and children who died violently, with bronze weapon points embedded in bones and evidence of burning that suggests bodies were deliberately incinerated. The demographic composition of these mass burials indicates that attackers made little distinction between combatants and non-combatants, pursuing policies of systematic elimination rather than conquest and incorporation. The geographic scope of simultaneous destructions extends from the Anatolian coast to the southern Levant, encompassing territories that had previously belonged to different political systems and cultural traditions. This broad distribution suggests military capabilities that enabled attacking forces to project power across vast distances while maintaining coordination and supply lines necessary for sustained campaigns. The ability to conduct simultaneous operations across such extensive territories implies organisational structures and logistical capabilities that rivaled those of established Bronze Age empires. Coastal sites throughout this region show evidence of attacks that combined naval assault with overland military operations, suggesting amphibious capabilities that enabled attackers to coordinate sea and land forces effectively. Harbour installations at destroyed sites were systematically demolished, with stone quays broken up and anchorage areas filled with debris that prevented future maritime use. This pattern indicates strategic thinking that aimed to eliminate the maritime infrastructure necessary for international trade and naval defence, effectively isolating surviving communities from external support and supply. The failure of traditional diplomatic mechanisms to address these coordinated attacks reveals the inadequacy of Bronze Age international relations for dealing with enemies who operated outside established political frameworks. The Amarna letters and other diplomatic archives contain no references to formal negotiations or treaty arrangements with Sea Peoples groups, suggesting that these forces either rejected traditional diplomatic protocols or were never approached through normal channels. This diplomatic isolation may have contributed to the systematic nature of destruction by eliminating opportunities for negotiated settlements that might have preserved some Bronze Age institutional structures. The coordinated devastation that had swept across the eastern Mediterranean reached the borders of Egypt during the 8th year of Ramesses III's reign, confronting the last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom with the most serious external threat the Nile Valley had faced since the Hyksos invasions over 4 centuries earlier. Unlike the gradual decline experienced by the Hittite Empire or the piecemeal destruction of Mycenaean palaces, Egypt's confrontation with the Sea Peoples represented a concentrated test of institutional resilience that would determine whether any of the great Bronze Age civilizations could survive the crisis intact. The royal inscriptions at Medinet Habu describe the approaching threat in unprecedented terms, characterizing the Sea Peoples not merely as raiders, but as a confederation of displaced populations seeking permanent settlement through military conquest. The hieroglyphic texts at Medinet Habu identify the attacking coalition as comprising multiple distinct groups, including the Peleset, Dieka, Shekelesh, Denayan and Vashesh, each contributing specialised military capabilities to a coordinated campaign that threatened Egypt from both land and sea. Egyptian intelligence networks, which had maintained extensive contacts throughout the eastern Mediterranean, provided Ramesses III with detailed information about the systematic destruction of Hittite territories and Levantine cities that preceded the assault on Egypt. This advance warning enabled Egyptian military planners to develop comprehensive defensive strategies that leveraged the kingdom's geographical advantages while compensating for numerical disadvantages against the attacking forces. The Egyptian military response to the Sea People's threat demonstrated the new kingdom's institutional capacity for large-scale mobilization and strategic planning that distinguished it from the fragmented political structures that had characterized other late Bronze Age civilizations. Ramesses III's military preparations involved coordinating defensive efforts across multiple theatres simultaneously, with land forces positioned to defend the Nile Delta, while naval squadrons prepared to contest Sea People's maritime supremacy in Egyptian territorial waters. The scope of these preparations required mobilizing resources from throughout the Egyptian Empire, including Nubian gold reserves, Levantine tribute obligations, and domestic agricultural surplus that had been accumulating in temple and royal granaries. The land campaign against the Sea People's coalition unfolded across the eastern Delta region, where Egyptian forces engaged enemy armies that had advanced through the devastated Levantine territories to reach the traditional invasion routes into Egypt. The Medinet Habu reliefs depict these battles as formal engagements between organised military formations, rather than the guerrilla warfare that had characterised much Sea People's activity in other regions. Egyptian chariot squadrons, supported by disciplined infantry formations, armed with composite bows and bronze-tipped spears, faced Sea People's warriors equipped with iron weapons, round shields, and the distinctive feathered headdresses that appear consistently in Egyptian artistic representations. The tactical innovations employed by Egyptian forces during these campaigns reflected lessons learned from intelligence reports about Sea People's military capabilities and the failures of other Bronze Age armies to counter their attacks effectively. Egyptian archers adopted new formations that maximised their rate of fire, while providing mutual protection against Sea People's close combat specialists, who excelled at penetrating traditional defensive lines. Chariot tactics were modified to emphasise mobility and harassment rather than direct assault, recognising that Sea People's infantry formations could effectively counter traditional chariot charges through disciplined spearwork and coordinated movement. Egyptian infantry units received enhanced training in close combat techniques designed to counter the superior individual fighting skills that Sea People's warriors had demonstrated in their campaigns against Hittite and Levantine forces. The bronze weapons produced in Egyptian armories during this period showed technological improvements, including reinforced sword tangs, improved spear socket construction, and enhanced armour designs that provided better protection against the iron weapons that some Sea People's groups had begun adopting. These technological adaptations demonstrate Egyptian metallurgical capabilities and the kingdom's ability to respond quickly to new military challenges. The naval confrontation in the Nile Delta represented the most innovative aspect of Egyptian defensive strategy, as Ramesses III's admirals developed new tactics specifically designed to counter Sea People's maritime advantages in Egyptian territorial waters. The Medinet Habu naval battle scenes depict Egyptian ships using the confined waters of the delta channels to negate Sea People's advantages in open water manoeuvring while exploiting Egyptian superiority in archery and coordinated tactical movement. Egyptian naval vessels, traditionally designed for river navigation rather than maritime warfare, were modified with reinforced construction and elevated fighting platforms that enabled effective combat against the larger Sea People's warships. The Egyptian naval tactical system relied heavily on coordinated archery volleys delivered from multiple vessels simultaneously, creating concentrated firepower that could overwhelm individual Sea People's ships despite their superior construction and larger crews. Egyptian archers, trained in the composite bow techniques that had made pharaonic armies dominant throughout the Near East, maintained significant advantages in range and accuracy over Sea People's warriors who relied primarily on close combat weapons. The confined waters of the delta channels prevented Sea People's vessels from using their superior speed and maneuverability to avoid Egyptian archery, forcing them into direct confrontations where Egyptian tactical coordination proved decisive. The innovative use of shore-based artillery during the naval engagement demonstrated Egyptian engineering capabilities and strategic thinking that adapted traditional siege warfare techniques to naval combat situations. Egyptian engineers positioned large composite bows and torsion engines along the delta shoreline, creating overlapping fields of fire that could engage Sea People's vessels, attempting to navigate the narrow channels leading to the Nile's main course. These shore-based weapons, operated by specialised crews trained in siege warfare, provided sustained firepower that complemented the mobile archery delivered by Egyptian naval vessels. Egyptian naval commanders also employed innovative ramming tactics that exploited their intimate knowledge of delta water conditions and channel configurations. Egyptian pilots, familiar with seasonal variations in water depth and current patterns, could maneuver their vessels into advantageous positions for ramming attacks while avoiding the underwater obstacles and shifting sandbars that posed hazards to foreign navigators. The Medinet Habu reliefs show Egyptian ships successfully ramming Sea People's vessels, with the foreign ships depicted as sinking or severely damaged, while Egyptian vessels remain intact and operational. The economic strain imposed by these prolonged military campaigns tested Egyptian institutional resilience and revealed both the kingdom's fundamental strengths and emerging vulnerabilities. The costs of maintaining large military forces in the field while simultaneously defending against multiple waves of attacks required unprecedented mobilization of Egyptian economic resources. Temple granaries throughout the kingdom were systematically emptied to supply military rations, while craft workshops were converted to weapons production and military equipment manufacturing. The administrative papyri from this period document emergency taxation measures and corvée labour obligations that place severe burdens on Egyptian agricultural communities already stressed by irregular Nile floods and regional economic disruption. Nubian gold production, which had provided crucial economic support for Egyptian military activities throughout the New Kingdom period, faced increasing difficulties as mining operations required enhanced security against raiding parties that may have included Sea People's groups operating in the Red Sea region. The fortified mining settlements at sites like Buhen and Semna received additional garrisons and defensive improvements, but these security measures increased operational costs while reducing the net gold production available for military expenditures. Egyptian administrative records document growing difficulties in maintaining the tribute obligations that Nubian provinces owed to the pharaonic government, reflecting broader economic pressures affecting the entire imperial system. The gradual settlement of some Sea People's groups in Egyptian territory represented a fundamental shift in pharaonic policy that acknowledged the impossibility of completely eliminating the foreign threat through military action alone. Following their military defeats in the Delta campaigns, substantial numbers of Peliset and Tieka warriors were settled in Egyptian garrison towns, where they could be integrated into the pharaonic military system while providing ongoing security against future Sea People's attacks. This settlement policy required careful management to prevent the foreign warriors from becoming a threat to internal Egyptian security, while ensuring their continued loyalty to pharaonic authority. The Peliset settlements in the southern Levant, established under Egyptian oversight following their military defeat, created a buffer zone that protected Egyptian territorial interests while providing the foreign warriors with agricultural land and trading opportunities. Egyptian administrative records document the complex negotiations required to establish these settlements, including agreements about land tenure, military service obligations, and religious practices that would govern Pelisate communities under Egyptian sovereignty. The success of these arrangements required Egyptian officials to balance the foreign warriors' desire for autonomy with pharaonic requirements for political control and military service. Tieka settlements along the Levantine coast served similar strategic purposes while reflecting different cultural traditions and economic specializations. The Tieka, who had demonstrated particular expertise in maritime activities during their raiding campaigns, were settled in coastal locations where their naval skills could support Egyptian commercial and military activities. These settlements required Egyptian investment in harbour facilities and defensive fortifications, but they provided valuable maritime capabilities that enhanced Egyptian control over eastern Mediterranean trade routes that had been disrupted by sea peoples' activities. The integration of foreign warriors into Egyptian military units created new challenges for pharaonic military organisation and command structures. Egyptian military scribes developed new administrative procedures for managing units that combined traditional Egyptian soldiers with foreign warriors who possessed different training, equipment and tactical traditions. The hieroglyphic records document experimental unit organisations that attempted to combine Egyptian archery capabilities with sea peoples' close combat expertise, creating hybrid formations that could exploit the advantages of both military traditions. The assassination conspiracy that emerged during the later years of Ramesses III's reign reflected the internal tensions created by prolonged military campaigns and the social disruption caused by foreign settlement policies. The judicial papyrus that documents the conspiracy reveals a complex plot involving court officials, military commanders, and members of the royal family who opposed the pharaoh's policies regarding sea people's settlement and resource allocation. The conspiracy's participants included high-ranking officials who had been responsible for implementing the foreign settlement programs, suggesting that these policies had created significant opposition within the Egyptian administrative establishment. The conspiracy's planning phase involved extensive coordination between court officials and provincial administrators who controlled access to military resources and communication networks necessary for a successful coup attempt. The judicial records reveal that conspirators had attempted to secure support from Nubian military units and foreign mercenary forces, indicating that the plot represented more than simple palace intrigue, but constituted a serious challenge to pharaonic authority. The discovery and suppression of the conspiracy required extensive security investigations that disrupted normal administrative functions and created lasting suspicion within the royal court. The trial proceedings following the conspiracy's discovery provide detailed evidence of the judicial procedures and legal concepts that governed Egyptian responses to treason and political rebellion. The court records document interrogation methods, evidence evaluation procedures, and sentencing guidelines that reveal sophisticated legal thinking about political crimes and appropriate punishments. The harsh sentences imposed on convicted conspirators, including execution and forced suicide, demonstrate the seriousness with which pharaonic authority regarded challenges to royal prerogatives and foreign policy decisions. The broader implications of the assassination conspiracy extended beyond immediate questions of royal security to encompass fundamental issues about Egyptian political stability and institutional continuity. The conspiracy's emergence during a period of external military pressure and internal economic stress revealed vulnerabilities in the pharaonic system that would influence subsequent political developments throughout the late New Kingdom period. The need for extensive security measures to protect royal authority diverted resources from military campaigns and administrative functions, contributing to the gradual decline in Egyptian capabilities that would characterize the Third Intermediate Period. The administrative reforms implemented following the conspiracy's suppression attempted to address the institutional weaknesses that had enabled the plot's development while maintaining the foreign settlement policies that Ramesses III considered essential for Egyptian security. New oversight procedures were established for monitoring communication between court officials and provincial administrators, while foreign military units received additional Egyptian supervisors to prevent potential collaboration with hostile forces. These security measures increased administrative costs and reduced governmental efficiency, but they provided necessary protection against future internal threats. The military consequences of the conspiracy extended beyond immediate security concerns to encompass broader questions about Egyptian military organisation and strategic planning. The involvement of military commanders in the conspiracy forced pharaonic authorities to conduct extensive purges within the officer corps, removing experienced leaders whose loyalty had become questionable. These personnel changes disrupted military command structures during a period when Egyptian forces continued to face external threats from Sea Peoples groups that had not been completely defeated or successfully integrated into Egyptian territories. The economic impact of prolonged military campaigns and internal security measures created fiscal pressures that would influence Egyptian political development for generations. The extraordinary expenditures required for defending against Sea Peoples attacks, establishing foreign settlements, and suppressing internal opposition exhausted royal treasuries and temple resources that had been accumulated during earlier periods of prosperity. The administrative papyri document emergency financial measures, including the melting of ceremonial gold objects, increased taxation on agricultural production, and reduced expenditures on traditional royal building projects. Temple institutions, which had served as crucial sources of economic support for pharaonic military activities, began asserting greater independence from royal authority as their resources became depleted through military expenditures. The high priest of Amun at Thebes, who controlled vast agricultural estates and craft workshops throughout Upper Egypt, negotiated new agreements with pharaonic authorities that reduced their tribute obligations while maintaining their religious prerogatives. These arrangements represented fundamental shifts in the balance of power between royal and religious authorities that would characterize Egyptian politics throughout the Third Intermediate Period. The gradual decline in Egyptian military capabilities during the final years of Ramesses III's reign reflected the cumulative impact of prolonged warfare, internal political instability, and economic exhaustion that had accompanied the kingdom's confrontation with the Sea Peoples crisis. Egyptian military units that had successfully defended the Delta against foreign invasion found themselves increasingly unable to project power beyond Egyptian borders or maintain effective control over distant territories that had previously contributed to pharaonic wealth and security. The administrative records document growing difficulties in maintaining communication with Nubian provinces and Levantine dependencies that had been integral components of the New Kingdom imperial system. The Egyptian victory over the Sea Peoples coalition marked not the restoration of the old Bronze Age order, but rather the beginning of a fundamental transformation that would reshape the political and cultural landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean. While Ramesses III had successfully defended the Nile Delta and maintained pharaonic control over core Egyptian territories, the broader regional system that had sustained late Bronze Age civilization lay in ruins. The Hittite Empire had vanished entirely, Mycenaean palaces stood abandoned, and the intricate trade networks that had connected distant regions for centuries had collapsed. In this transformed landscape, new peoples and political formations emerged to fill the power vacuum, creating a radically different world that bore little resemblance to the sophisticated palace economies of the preceding era. The Peliset, whom Egyptian sources identified as one of the most formidable Sea Peoples groups, established themselves along the southern Levantine coast following their military defeat in the Delta campaigns. Rather than simply disappearing after their unsuccessful assault on Egypt, these warriors and their families settled in a narrow coastal strip stretching from Gaza to Ashdod, creating a series of independent city-states that would dominate this region for centuries. The archaeological evidence from sites like Tel Es-Safi, Ashkelon and Ekron reveals a distinctive material culture that combined elements from their presumed Aegean origins with local Canaanite traditions and Egyptian influences acquired during their confrontation with pharaonic forces. The Philistine city-states that emerged from these settlements developed political structures that differed markedly from both the centralized palace economies that had characterized late Bronze Age civilization and the tribal confederations that dominated the interior regions. Each major settlement functioned as an autonomous political unit ruled by a serenim. a title that appears to derive from the Greek word tyrannos, suggesting leadership structures that may have originated in the Aegean world. These rulers controlled surrounding agricultural territories while maintaining the martial traditions that had enabled their ancestors to challenge the greatest powers of the Bronze Age world. Philistine material culture reveals a sophisticated synthesis of diverse cultural traditions that reflects both their complex origins and their adaptation to Levantine conditions. Their distinctive pottery, characterized by elaborate geometric designs and bird motifs executed in red and black paint on cream-coloured backgrounds, demonstrates clear connections to late Helladic 3EC ceramic traditions from the Aegean while incorporating local production techniques and decorative elements. The famous Philistine stirrup jars, found throughout their territorial holdings, maintain the basic form of Mycenaean prototypes, while displaying decorative schemes that suggest local artistic development and cultural adaptation. The ironworking technology that appears in Philistine archaeological contexts represents one of the most significant technological innovations of this transitional period. While iron weapons had not been decisive factors in the Sea People's campaigns against Bronze Age civilizations, the Philistines developed sophisticated iron production techniques that gave them significant military advantages over their neighbours, who continued to rely primarily on bronze equipment. Excavations at Philistine sites have revealed ironworking installations, including furnaces, bellows systems, and specialised tools that demonstrate advanced metallurgical knowledge and organised production systems. Philistine religious practices combined elements from multiple traditions in ways that reflect their complex cultural heritage and adaptation to local conditions. Archaeological evidence from Ekron reveals temple complexes that incorporate Aegean architectural features, including hearth altars and columned halls, while also displaying Canaanite religious symbols and Egyptian decorative motifs. The famous Ashdod figurines, depicting seated female figures with distinctive headdresses, suggest religious traditions that may have originated in the Aegean world while adapting to local theological concepts and ritual requirements. The agricultural systems developed in Philistine territories demonstrate sophisticated adaptation to Mediterranean environmental conditions and the integration of diverse farming traditions. Archaeological surveys reveal extensive olive oil production facilities that employed advanced pressing techniques to extract oil for both local consumption and regional trade. The scale of these operations, evidenced by massive stone presses and storage installations, indicates that olive oil production became a crucial economic foundation for Philistine prosperity and political independence. The military organisation of Philistine city-states reflected their warrior heritage while adapting to the defensive requirements of settled agricultural communities. Archaeological evidence reveals extensive fortification systems at major sites, including massive earthwork ramparts, stone-built gates with complex defensive approaches, and strategically positioned watchtowers that could coordinate defensive responses across multiple settlements. These fortifications incorporated both Aegean architectural traditions and local defensive innovations, creating hybrid systems that proved effective against the various military threats that characterized this unstable period. Philistine expansion into the interior regions brought them into direct contact with emerging Israelite tribal groups, creating conflicts that would influence regional political development for centuries. The archaeological evidence from sites in the Shephelah region reveals a complex pattern of settlement competition and military confrontation, as these two populations struggled for control over agricultural territories and strategic positions. The distinctive material cultures of these groups provide clear evidence for their separate identities and territorial boundaries, while also revealing areas of cultural interaction and technological exchange. The gradual decline of Egyptian control over the southern Levant created opportunities for Philistine political expansion that extended their influence far beyond their original coastal settlements. Egyptian administrative records from the late 20th dynasty document growing difficulties in maintaining effective control over traditional dependencies in the region, while Philistine settlements expanded eastward into areas that had previously been under direct pharaonic administration. This territorial expansion required sophisticated military organisation and diplomatic capabilities that demonstrate the political maturation of Philistine institutions. The Neo-Assyrian Empire's emergence as a dominant regional power represented the most significant political development in the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse, as Assyrian rulers exploited the power vacuum created by Hittite fragmentation to expand their control over vast territories that had previously been beyond their reach. The reign of Tiglath-Pileser would mark the beginning of systematic Assyrian expansion into former Hittite territories, with military campaigns that demonstrated new tactical capabilities and organisational structures adapted to the changed political landscape of the post-Bronze Age world. Assyrian military innovations during this period included the systematic adoption of iron weapons and the development of siege warfare techniques that proved devastatingly effective against the fortified cities that had survived the initial Bronze Age collapse. The iron-tipped spears and swords that equipped Assyrian infantry units provided significant advantages over enemies who continued to rely on bronze weapons, while Assyrian siege engines and assault tactics enabled rapid capture of strongly fortified positions. These technological and tactical advantages, combined with sophisticated logistics and communication systems, enabled Assyrian forces to conduct sustained campaigns across vast distances while maintaining effective coordination and supply. The administrative systems developed by Neo-Assyrian rulers to govern their expanding territories represented significant innovations in imperial organisation that addressed the challenges of controlling diverse populations across extensive geographical regions. Unlike the palace-centred economies that had characterised late Bronze Age empires, the Assyrian system emphasised military control and tribute extraction through networks of appointed governors who answered directly to the royal court. These officials, drawn primarily from the Assyrian military and administrative elite, maintained garrisons in strategic locations, while supervising local rulers who retained limited autonomy in exchange for regular tribute payments and military service. Assyrian expansion into the Euphrates Valley brought them into direct contact with Aramean tribal groups who had established themselves in the power vacuum created by Hittite collapse. These Aramean populations, organised in tribal confederations led by warrior chiefs, controlled crucial agricultural territories and trade routes that the Assyrians required for their continued expansion. The resulting conflicts combined traditional Near Eastern siege warfare with innovative tactics adapted to fighting mobile tribal armies that could avoid direct confrontation while conducting effective guerrilla operations. The cultural impact of Assyrian expansion extended far beyond simple political control to encompass systematic efforts to transform the cultural and religious practices of conquered populations. Assyrian administrative records document extensive deportation programs that moved conquered populations to distant regions while settling Assyrian colonists in strategic locations throughout the empire. These population transfers, conducted on a scale unprecedented in ancient warfare, aimed to prevent regional rebellions while creating loyal populations that would support continued Assyrian control. Assyrian military campaigns in former Hittite territories revealed the complete collapse of the political structures that had maintained order in these regions during the late Bronze Age period. The great fortress cities that had anchored Hittite provincial administration lay abandoned or were occupied by small populations that lacked the resources and organisation necessary for effective resistance. Assyrian forces encountered minimal organised opposition as they advanced through regions that had previously required major military campaigns to conquer, demonstrating the thoroughness of the political collapse that had accompanied the end of the Bronze Age. The integration of former Hittite territories into the expanding Assyrian Empire required extensive administrative innovations and cultural adaptations that would influence Near Eastern political development for centuries. Assyrian officials encountered diverse populations speaking multiple languages and maintaining distinct cultural traditions that had been preserved despite the collapse of centralized political authority. The successful integration of these populations required flexible administrative approaches that balanced Assyrian political control with respect for local traditions and religious practices. Phoenician maritime expansion represented another crucial development in the post-Bronze Age transformation, as coastal populations who had survived the initial collapse developed new trading networks that gradually restored commercial connections across the Mediterranean. The Phoenician cities of Tyre, Sidon and Byblos had maintained their independence during the Bronze Age collapse through a combination of defensive preparations, diplomatic flexibility, and maritime capabilities that enabled them to avoid the systematic destruction that had devastated inland centres. The development of Phoenician trading networks required significant innovations in maritime technology and commercial organisation that addressed the challenges of conducting long-distance trade in a fragmented political landscape. Phoenician shipbuilders developed new vessel designs that combined cargo capacity with defensive capabilities, enabling merchant expeditions to defend themselves against pirates while carrying substantial quantities of goods across long distances. These ships featured reinforced construction, elevated fighting platforms, and specialised storage areas that could accommodate diverse cargo types while providing protection for valuable merchandise. Phoenician commercial expansion into the Western Mediterranean created new trading relationships that gradually replaced the complex international networks that had characterised late Bronze Age commerce. The establishment of trading posts and colonies in Cyprus, Sicily, Sardinia, and eventually the Iberian Peninsula and North Africa created a maritime commercial empire that spanned the entire Mediterranean basin. These settlements served as bases for further expansion, while providing secure harbours and supply stations that enabled Phoenician merchants to conduct increasingly ambitious trading expeditions. The cultural impact of Phoenician expansion extended far beyond simple commercial exchange, to include the transmission of technological innovations, artistic traditions, and religious practices that would influence Mediterranean civilization for centuries. Phoenician merchants carried ironworking techniques, alphabetic writing systems, and artistic motifs throughout their trading networks, creating cultural connections that transcended political boundaries. The Phoenician alphabet, derived from earlier Canaanite writing systems, became the foundation for Greek and Latin scripts that would dominate Mediterranean literacy for millennia. Phoenician religious practices, centred on the worship of Baal, Astarte, and other Canaanite deities, spread throughout their commercial networks and influenced local religious traditions in distant regions. Archaeological evidence from Phoenician settlements reveals temple complexes that maintained traditional architectural forms while adapting to local conditions and incorporating regional religious elements. These religious centres served not only as places of worship but also as commercial and diplomatic meeting points that facilitated cultural exchange and political negotiation. The gradual emergence of early Iron Age kingdoms in the interior regions of the Levant reflected the slow process of political reorganisation that followed the collapse of Bronze Age palace economies. The tribal confederations that had maintained themselves in marginal areas during the late Bronze Age began consolidating their control over larger territories as the absence of imperial oversight created opportunities for territorial expansion and political development. These emerging political formations combined traditional tribal structures with innovations in military organisation and administrative practice that enabled them to control settled agricultural populations. The early Israelite tribal confederations that emerged in the central hill country represent one of the most significant examples of this political transformation. Archaeological evidence from sites like Shiloh, Bethel, and early Jerusalem reveals the gradual development of settlement hierarchies and administrative structures that enabled tribal leaders to coordinate activities across extensive territories. The distinctive material culture that appears at these sites, characterized by simple pottery traditions and limited evidence for social stratification, suggests political organizations that differed markedly from both the palace economies of the late Bronze Age and the city-state systems that characterized coastal regions. The development of Israelite religious traditions during this period reflects the complex cultural transformations that accompanied political reorganization in the post-Bronze Age world. Archaeological evidence suggests that early Israelite religious practices incorporated elements from various Canaanite traditions, while developing distinctive theological concepts and ritual practices. The absence of elaborate temple complexes and cult statuary at early Israelite sites suggests religious traditions that emphasized different forms of divine worship and community organization than those that had characterized late Bronze Age palace religions. The gradual consolidation of Israelite tribal territories required military innovations and political developments that enabled these communities to compete effectively with more established political formations, including Philistine city-states and surviving Canaanite centers. The adoption of iron weapons and defensive technologies provided military advantages that supported territorial expansion, while the development of administrative systems enabled tribal leaders to coordinate activities across larger geographical areas and more diverse populations. Aramaean political formations emerged throughout Syria and northern Mesopotamia as tribal groups established control over territories that had previously been governed by Hittite and Assyrian administrators. These Aramaean kingdoms combined traditional tribal leadership structures with innovations in urban planning and administrative organization that enabled them to govern settled populations while maintaining their military effectiveness. The archaeological evidence from sites like Damascus, Hamath, and Tel Halaf reveals the development of fortified urban centers that served as political and commercial focal points for surrounding territories. The cultural influence of Aramaean populations extended far beyond their immediate territorial holdings through their role as intermediaries in the commercial and cultural networks that gradually replaced late Bronze Age international systems. The Aramaic language, which became the lingua franca of the Persian Empire, facilitated communication across diverse populations, while Aramaean merchants established trading connections that linked emerging political formations throughout the Near East. These commercial networks provided crucial economic foundations for political development, while enabling cultural exchange that influenced artistic, religious, and technological traditions across vast geographical regions. The transformation of settlement patterns throughout the Eastern Mediterranean during this period reveals the fundamental changes in social organization and economic systems that accompanied the transition from Bronze Age palace economies to Iron Age political formations. Archaeological surveys demonstrate widespread abandonment of sites that had been integral to late Bronze Age administrative and commercial systems, while new settlements emerged in locations that provided better defensive positions and access to local resources rather than long-distance trade routes. The archaeological evidence accumulated from decades of excavation across Bronze Age sites has generated intense scholarly debate about the fundamental causes underlying the systematic collapse of late Bronze Age civilization. Modern historians and archaeologists have developed competing theoretical frameworks that attempt to explain how sophisticated palace economies controlling vast territories and populations could disappear so rapidly and completely around 1200 BC. These interpretative approaches reflect not only different assessments of the available evidence, but also broader philosophical disagreements about the relative importance of environmental factors, human agency, and systemic vulnerabilities in driving historical change. Environmental determinism emerged as one of the most influential explanatory frameworks during the late 20th century, as paleoclimatic research revealed dramatic environmental changes that coincided precisely with the Bronze Age collapse. Proponents of this approach argue that sustained drought conditions and climatic instability created cascading effects that undermined the agricultural foundations upon which late Bronze Age civilizations depended. The paleoclimatic evidence supporting this interpretation includes ice core data from Greenland showing significant cooling events around 1250 BC, lake sediment cores from Anatolia revealing reduced precipitation levels, and tree ring chronologies demonstrating markedly decreased growth rates across the Eastern Mediterranean region. The environmental determinist interpretation emphasizes the vulnerability of Bronze Age agricultural systems to climatic variation, particularly in marginal areas where farming communities had expanded during earlier periods of favourable weather conditions. Mycenaean settlements in the Argolid Plain, for example, had developed intensive agricultural practices that maximised productivity during stable climatic periods, but proved extremely vulnerable when environmental conditions deteriorated. The complex drainage systems that had enabled cultivation of previously unusable land required constant maintenance and adequate water supplies that became impossible to maintain during prolonged drought periods. Hittite agricultural territories in central Anatolia faced similar environmental pressures as reduced precipitation levels made traditional farming practices unsustainable across extensive regions that had previously supported dense rural populations. The administrative tablets from Hattusa document growing difficulties in collecting agricultural tribute from provincial territories, suggesting that environmental stress had reduced productivity below the levels necessary to maintain imperial administrative systems. The systematic abandonment of marginal agricultural settlements throughout Anatolia during this period provides archaeological confirmation of environmental pressures that forced populations to concentrate in areas with more reliable water sources. Critics of environmental determinism argue that climatic changes alone cannot explain the sudden and systematic nature of Bronze Age collapse, pointing to evidence that many regions had successfully adapted to previous episodes of environmental stress without experiencing complete civilizational breakdown. The Egyptian kingdom, which faced similar drought conditions and irregular Nile floods during this period, managed to maintain a political continuity and administrative control despite significant economic pressures. This differential survival rate suggests that environmental factors, while important, interacted with other variables including political organisation, military capabilities, and social cohesion to determine which civilization survived the crisis. The environmental determinist framework also struggles to explain the systematic destruction evident at many Bronze Age sites, where archaeological evidence clearly indicates deliberate burning and vandalism rather than simple abandonment due to environmental pressures. The destruction layers at Ugarit, Pylos, and numerous other sites contain evidence of violent conflict including scattered weapons, human skeletal remains showing trauma, and building destruction patterns that suggest coordinated military action rather than gradual abandonment due to agricultural failure. Systems collapse theory offers a more sophisticated analytical framework that examines the internal vulnerabilities of Bronze Age political and economic systems that made them susceptible to disruption from multiple sources. This theoretical approach emphasizes the interconnected nature of late Bronze Age civilization, arguing that the complex networks of trade, diplomacy, and administrative control that enabled unprecedented prosperity also created dangerous dependencies that could trigger cascading failures when disrupted. The palace economies that dominated this period had achieved remarkable efficiency through specialization and centralized control. But these same characteristics made them extremely vulnerable to external shocks that could disrupt their essential functions. The interconnectedness of Bronze Age trade networks created particular vulnerabilities as regional disruptions could affect economic systems across vast geographical distances. The tin trade routes that supplied essential raw materials for bronze production stretched from Afghanistan to Cornwall, requiring stable political conditions and secure transportation across multiple political boundaries. When conflicts or political instability disrupted any segment of these supply chains, the effects rippled throughout the entire network, forcing communities dependent on bronze technology to seek alternative sources or adapt to reduced availability of essential materials. The administrative complexity that enabled palace economies to manage vast territories and diverse populations also created potential failure points that could trigger systemic collapse. The Linear B tablets from Mycenaean palaces reveal bureaucratic systems of extraordinary sophistication that tracked individual livestock, complex land tenure arrangements, and elaborate craft production quotas. However, these administrative systems required large numbers of trained scribes, standardized procedures, and reliable communication networks that could be disrupted by relatively minor political or military crises. Systems collapse theorists argue that the centralized nature of Bronze Age political organization created dangerous concentrations of administrative and economic control that left entire regions vulnerable to the failure of individual palace centers. When the palace at Pylos was destroyed, the entire administrative apparatus that governed southwestern Greece disappeared simultaneously, leaving rural communities without the institutional framework necessary for coordinated defense, resource distribution, or political organization. This concentration of essential functions in vulnerable centers created systemic fragility that enabled localized disruptions to trigger regional collapse. The tribute and redistribution systems that connected palace centers with their rural hinterlands created additional vulnerabilities as economic relationships became increasingly complex and interdependent. Rural communities that had specialized in particular forms of production depended upon palace redistribution networks to obtain essential goods that they could no longer produce locally. When these networks were disrupted by military action or administrative breakdown, rural communities faced immediate survival crises that forced rapid adaptation or abandonment of traditional settlement patterns. Migration and invasion hypotheses focus on the role of population movements and military conflicts in triggering Bronze Age collapse, emphasizing human agency and deliberate destruction rather than environmental or systemic factors. Proponents of invasion theories argue that the archaeological evidence for systematic destruction at Bronze Age sites indicates coordinated military campaigns by external enemies rather than internal collapse due to environmental or administrative pressures. The Sea Peoples, in this interpretation, represent organized military forces that deliberately targeted Bronze Age centers for conquest and plunder, using superior military technology and tactics to overcome established defensive systems. The invasion hypothesis draws strong support from Egyptian sources that describe coordinated attacks by Sea Peoples coalitions employing both land and naval forces in systematic campaigns against Bronze Age centers. The Medinet Habu reliefs provide detailed visual documentation of foreign warriors equipped with distinctive weapons and military equipment that differed markedly from traditional Bronze Age military technology. The systematic nature of destructions across multiple regions within narrow timeframes suggests coordinated military action rather than coincidental local conflicts or environmental disasters. Archaeological evidence from destruction layers supports invasion theories through the presence of foreign weapon types, burned buildings, and human skeletal remains showing trauma consistent with violent conflict. The bronze weapons found at destroyed sites often display technological innovations, including improved metallurgy and design features that provided military advantages over traditional Bronze Age equipment. The appearance of these superior weapons in destruction contexts suggests that attacking forces possessed technological capabilities that enabled them to overcome established military systems. Critics of invasion theories argue that the evidence for foreign military technology is insufficient to support claims of technological superiority that would enable small raiding forces to overcome the massive military establishments of Bronze Age empires. The Hittite Empire maintained professional military forces numbering in the tens of thousands, equipped with bronze weapons and chariot formations that had dominated Near Eastern warfare for centuries. The idea that relatively small groups of foreign raiders could systematically defeat these established military systems requires more compelling evidence of technological or tactical advantages than currently exists in the archaeological record. The migration hypothesis offers a more nuanced interpretation that emphasizes population movements driven by environmental pressures and political instability rather than organized military conquest. This approach suggests that large populations displaced by drought conditions, political fragmentation, or economic collapse sought new territories through migration rather than coordinated invasion. The violence evident in archaeological contexts resulted from conflicts between migrating populations and established communities competing for increasingly scarce resources rather than systematic military campaigns aimed at conquest and plunder. Migration theorists argue that environmental pressures affecting multiple regions simultaneously created massive population displacements that overwhelmed the capacity of receiving areas to integrate newcomers peacefully. The Aegean region, which may have been the source of some Sea Peoples groups, experienced widespread settlement abandonment during the late 13th century BC as Mycenaean palace economies collapsed and rural communities could no longer sustain their populations. These displaced populations, possessing military skills and maritime capabilities developed during the Late Bronze Age, sought new territories through seaborne migration that brought them into conflict with established populations throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. The internal versus external causation debate reflects fundamental disagreements about whether Bronze Age collapse resulted primarily from internal weaknesses within palace economies or external pressures from migrating populations and environmental changes. Internal causation theories emphasize the inherent instability of highly centralized political systems that concentrated power and resources in vulnerable palace centers, while creating dependencies that could trigger cascading failures. External causation theories focus on environmental pressures, population movements, and military conflicts that overwhelmed otherwise stable political systems through forces beyond their control. Recent archaeological research has revealed evidence supporting both internal and external factors, suggesting that Bronze Age collapse resulted from complex interactions between systemic vulnerabilities and external pressures rather than single causative factors. The palace economies had indeed created dangerous dependencies and administrative complexities that made them vulnerable to disruption, but environmental changes and population movements provided the specific triggers that activated these vulnerabilities and prevented successful adaptation to changing circumstances. Synthesis approaches that combine multiple explanatory factors have gained increasing acceptance among scholars who recognize that complex historical phenomena like Bronze Age collapse cannot be adequately explained through single-factor theories. These synthetic interpretations acknowledge that environmental stress, political instability, technological change, and population movements all contributed to the crisis, while recognizing that their relative importance varied across different regions and time periods. The Hittite Empire may have been particularly vulnerable to environmental pressures due to its dependence on marginal agricultural territories, while Mycenaean palaces faced greater challenges from internal political fragmentation and external military threats. The synthetic approach emphasizes the importance of feedback loops and cascading effects that amplified initial disruptions into systemic crises. Environmental stress reduced agricultural productivity, which weakened palace economies and reduced their military capabilities, which made them more vulnerable to external attacks, which disrupted trade networks and administrative systems, which further reduced economic productivity and political stability. These interconnected effects created downward spirals that proved impossible to reverse once they gained momentum. Technological change played a crucial role in Bronze Age collapse through the gradual adoption of ironworking techniques that provided military advantages to populations who mastered these new technologies. While iron weapons were not decisive factors in the initial Sea Peoples attacks, their increasing availability during the 12th and 11th centuries BC created military imbalances that favoured populations who could produce and maintain iron equipment. The superior cutting ability and durability of iron weapons provided significant advantages in close combat situations, while the greater availability of iron ore compared to tin made these weapons more accessible to populations who lacked access to traditional bronze trade networks. The political instability that accompanied Bronze Age collapse created opportunities for technological innovation and military experimentation, as traditional authorities lost their ability to control weapon production and military training. Displaced populations and emerging political formations experimented with new tactical approaches and equipment designs that proved more effective than traditional Bronze Age military systems. These innovations spread rapidly through networks of displaced warriors and migrating populations, creating military capabilities that established powers could not quickly counter. Population movements during this period involved not only displaced refugees seeking new territories, but also skilled craftsmen, warriors, and administrators who carried technological knowledge and organisational expertise to new regions. The settlement of Sea Peoples groups in Egyptian territory and the Levant facilitated the transmission of ironworking techniques, maritime technologies, and military innovations that would influence regional development for centuries. These knowledge transfers accelerated technological change while creating new forms of political and military organisation adapted to post-Bronze Age conditions. The role of social and economic inequality in Bronze Age collapse remains a subject of ongoing scholarly investigation, as researchers attempt to understand how internal social tensions may have contributed to political instability and reduced resilience to external pressures. Palace economies had created significant disparities between elite populations who controlled administrative and military functions and rural communities who provided agricultural surplus and military service. These inequalities may have reduced popular support for palace authorities and created internal conflicts that weakened defensive capabilities during periods of external threat. Archaeological evidence from late Bronze Age sites reveals increasing militarization and defensive construction that suggests growing internal tensions and security concerns during the centuries preceding collapse. The massive fortification projects undertaken at Mycenaean centres required enormous investments of labour and resources that may have strained palace economies while indicating serious threats to established authorities. The concentration of populations within fortified centres may have created unsustainable demographic pressures while reducing agricultural productivity and economic flexibility. The collapse of Bronze Age trade networks created economic disruptions that affected all levels of society, but may have had a particularly severe impacts on communities that had become dependent on specialised production for palace redistribution systems. Rural communities that had focused on olive oil production, textile manufacturing, or metallurgy for palace consumption faced immediate crises when these markets disappeared. The inability to quickly adapt production systems to changed economic conditions may have forced widespread population movements and settlement abandonment that contributed to broader social instability. Religious and ideological factors also played important roles in Bronze Age collapse, as the divine kingship concepts that legitimised palace authority became increasingly difficult to maintain during periods of military defeat and economic decline. The elaborate religious ceremonies and monumental construction projects that demonstrated royal power and divine favour required substantial resources that became unavailable during the crisis period. The failure to maintain traditional religious observances may have undermined popular confidence in palace authorities while creating opportunities for alternative political and religious movements to challenge established power structures. The transformation of the Eastern Mediterranean world between 1200 and 1000 BC represents one of history's most dramatic examples of civilizational collapse and subsequent recovery, offering crucial insights into the vulnerability of complex societies and the mechanisms through which human communities adapt to catastrophic change. The systematic destruction of palace economies and the emergence of radically different political formations created a historical laboratory that reveals fundamental patterns of social resilience and institutional failure that resonate across millennia of human experience. Modern scholars examining this transformation have identified striking parallels with other episodes of civilizational collapse, while recognising the unique characteristics that made the Bronze Age crisis particularly devastating and transformative. The Roman Empire's gradual decline during the 4th and 5th centuries AD provides perhaps the most instructive comparison with Bronze Age collapse, revealing both similarities and crucial differences in how complex societies respond to systemic pressures. Like the late Bronze Age palace economies, the Roman imperial system had created extensive networks of trade, administration and military control that enabled unprecedented prosperity, while generating dangerous dependencies on centralized institutions. The barbarian migrations that contributed to Roman collapse paralleled Sea Peoples movements in combining displaced populations seeking new territories with military pressures that overwhelmed established defensive systems. However, The Roman collapse occurred over several centuries rather than the compressed time frame that characterised Bronze Age destruction, allowing for gradual adaptation and the preservation of institutional knowledge that enabled eventual recovery. The administrative continuity that characterised Roman decline contrasts sharply with the complete institutional breakdown evident in Bronze Age collapse. Roman legal traditions, administrative procedures, and literary culture survived the empire's political fragmentation through Christian monasteries, Byzantine institutions, and barbarian kingdoms that maintained modified versions of imperial practices. The preservation of Latin literacy and Roman law provided foundations for medieval European development that had no equivalent in the post-Bronze Age world, where Linear B script disappeared entirely and palace administrative traditions vanished without trace. The Mayan civilization's collapse during the 9th and 10th centuries AD offers another revealing parallel, particularly in demonstrating how environmental pressures can interact with political instability to trigger rapid civilizational breakdown. Like Bronze Age palace economies, classic Maya city-states had developed sophisticated agricultural systems that supported dense populations through intensive cultivation techniques and complex water management infrastructure. Prolonged drought conditions during the terminal Classic period created agricultural crises that undermined political authority and triggered warfare between competing centres, leading to widespread abandonment of major cities and the collapse of elaborate administrative systems. The Maya collapse demonstrates how specialised knowledge systems can disappear rapidly when the institutions that maintain them face existential threats. The sophisticated astronomical calculations, mathematical concepts, and hieroglyphic writing that had characterized classic Maya civilization survived only in fragmentary form among reduced populations that lacked the resources to maintain elaborate scribal schools and ceremonial centers. This pattern of knowledge loss parallels the disappearance of Linear B literacy and palace administrative traditions in the post-Bronze Age world, illustrating how institutional collapse can eliminate accumulated cultural achievements within single generations. The recovery patterns evident in Maya territories after the Classic collapse reveal important differences from Bronze Age developments. Maya populations in the northern Yucatan successfully adapted their political and economic systems to changed environmental conditions, creating new forms of urban organisation and trade networks that enabled continued cultural development. The preservation of Maya languages, religious traditions, and basic technological knowledge provided foundations for post-classic recovery that were largely absent in the Bronze Age world, where fundamental cultural discontinuities marked the transition to Iron Age civilizations. The Chinese dynastic cycle provides additional perspectives on civilizational collapse and recovery, demonstrating how political fragmentation can occur within continuous cultural frameworks that preserve essential institutional knowledge and social practices. The transitions between Chinese dynasties often involved periods of warfare, population displacement, and economic disruption that resembled aspects of Bronze Age collapse, but the persistence of Chinese writing systems, administrative traditions, and cultural practices enabled relatively rapid restoration of centralized political control. The Mandate of Heaven concept provided ideological frameworks for political transition that legitimized dynastic change while maintaining cultural continuity. The transformation from Bronze Age palace economies to Iron Age political formations represents a fundamental shift in the organization of political power and economic production that would influence Mediterranean and Near Eastern development for millennia. The centralized palace systems that had dominated the late Bronze Age concentrated administrative, military, and religious authority in royal courts that controlled vast territories through elaborate bureaucratic hierarchies. These systems achieved remarkable efficiency in resource mobilization and territorial administration, but proved extremely vulnerable to disruption when key institutions faced simultaneous pressures from multiple sources. Iron Age city-states that emerged from Bronze Age collapse adopted radically different organisational principles that distributed political authority among broader segments of the population, while maintaining smaller territorial scales that proved more manageable and resilient. The Greek poleis that developed during the Archaic period exemplified this transformation, creating political institutions that balanced aristocratic leadership with popular participation while maintaining defensive capabilities adequate for protecting limited territories. These smaller political units proved more adaptable to changing circumstances while fostering cultural innovations that would influence Western civilization for thousands of years. The Phoenician city-states demonstrated alternative approaches to post-Bronze Age political organisation that emphasised commercial networks and maritime expansion rather than territorial conquest and agricultural control. Tyre, Sidon and other Phoenician centres developed political institutions that supported long-distance trade while maintaining independence from larger territorial empires through diplomatic flexibility and naval capabilities. The commercial networks gradually restored Mediterranean-wide connections that had been severed during the Bronze Age collapse, creating new forms of cultural exchange and economic integration. Territorial kingdoms that emerged in the Near East during the Iron Age represented another organisational innovation that combined elements of Bronze Age imperial administration with tribal confederations and city-state institutions. The Neo-Assyrian Empire developed administrative systems that proved more resilient than their Bronze Age predecessors through greater military emphasis, systematic population transfers and administrative practices that reduced dependence on individual palace centres. These innovations enabled Assyrian rulers to maintain control over vast territories while adapting to the political fragmentation and cultural diversity that characterised the post-Bronze Age world. The development of alphabetic writing systems represents one of the most significant cultural innovations to emerge from Bronze Age collapse, demonstrating how catastrophic change can stimulate technological and cultural developments that prove superior to previous systems. The complex syllabic scripts that had served palace bureaucracies required extensive training and were closely tied to specific administrative functions that disappeared with palace collapse. The alphabetic systems developed by Phoenicians and other Levantine populations proved far more accessible and adaptable, enabling literacy to spread beyond narrow scribal elites to broader segments of society. The Greek adoption and modification of Phoenician alphabetic writing created the foundation for literary traditions that would dominate Western culture for millennia. The addition of vowel symbols to the Phoenician consonantal system enabled more precise representation of spoken language, while maintaining the simplicity that made alphabetic writing accessible to non-specialist users. This technological innovation facilitated the preservation and transmission of cultural knowledge through written literature rather than institutional memory, creating more resilient systems for maintaining cultural continuity across political disruptions. The emergence of coinage during the 7th century BC in Lydian and Greek territories represented another crucial innovation that addressed economic problems created by Bronze Age collapse. The complex redistribution systems that had characterized palace economies required elaborate administrative apparatus and standardized weights and measures that disappeared with palace institutions. Coined money provided a more flexible medium of exchange that enabled commercial transactions without requiring centralized administrative oversight, facilitating the development of market economies that proved more resilient than palace-controlled redistribution systems. The Greek Dark Ages that followed Mycenaean collapse illustrate both the destructive impact of civilizational breakdown and the creative potential that can emerge from periods of institutional collapse. The disappearance of palace institutions eliminated the social stratification, administrative complexity and artistic traditions that had characterized late Bronze Age Greek civilization. But this same institutional destruction created opportunities for cultural innovation and political experimentation that would not have been possible within existing power structures. The oral traditions that preserved heroic narratives during the Dark Ages provided foundations for epic literature that surpassed the administrative records and religious texts that had dominated palace literacy. The development of democratic institutions in archaic and classical Greece demonstrates how political innovation can emerge from the institutional vacuum created by civilizational collapse. The absence of established monarchical traditions and aristocratic hierarchies that had been eliminated during the Dark Ages enabled Greek communities to experiment with forms of popular government that would have been impossible within existing Bronze Age political frameworks. These democratic innovations, while limited to free male citizens, represented unprecedented extensions of political participation that influenced political thought and institutional development throughout subsequent Western history. The religious transformations that accompanied the transition from Bronze Age to Iron Age civilizations reveal how spiritual and ideological systems adapt to changed social and political circumstances. The elaborate state cults that had characterized palace religions, with their emphasis on divine kingship and centralized ritual authority, gave way to more diverse religious traditions that emphasized personal relationships with deities and local community practices. The development of ethical monotheism in ancient Israel and philosophical traditions in Greece represented radical departures from Bronze Age religious concepts that would profoundly influence subsequent cultural development. The long-term consequences of Bronze Age collapse extended far beyond the immediate political and economic disruptions to encompass fundamental changes in cultural values, social organization, and technological development that shaped subsequent historical trajectories. The experience of civilizational breakdown and recovery created cultural memories and institutional innovations that influenced how later societies approached questions of political organization, military strategy, and economic development. The emphasis on defensive capabilities, political flexibility, and cultural preservation that characterized post-Bronze Age societies reflected lessons learned from the catastrophic failures of palace economies. Modern relevance of Bronze Age collapse becomes particularly apparent when examining contemporary challenges facing interconnected global systems that share structural similarities with late Bronze Age civilization. The complex supply chains that support modern industrial economies create dependencies comparable to the trade networks that connected Bronze Age palace economies, while the concentration of essential functions in vulnerable centres parallels the administrative centralisation that characterised late Bronze Age political organisation. The environmental pressures and population movements that contributed to Bronze Age collapse find contemporary parallels in climate change and global migration patterns that challenge existing political and economic institutions. The technological dependencies that characterize modern societies create vulnerabilities comparable to those that affected Bronze Age civilizations, when their essential supply networks were disrupted. The reliance on rare earth elements for electronic devices, complex pharmaceutical supply chains for medical treatments, and integrated transportation networks for food distribution creates potential failure points that could trigger cascading disruptions similar to those that affected Bronze Age trade networks. The concentration of manufacturing capabilities in limited geographical regions creates additional vulnerabilities that parallel the resource dependencies that made Bronze Age civilization susceptible to supply disruptions. The lessons of Bronze Age collapse suggest that resilient societies require institutional diversity, technological flexibility, and cultural adaptability that enable effective responses to unexpected challenges. The palace economies that dominated the late Bronze Age achieved remarkable prosperity through specialization and centralization, but these same characteristics made them extremely vulnerable when external pressures exceeded their adaptive capabilities. Modern societies can learn from this historical experience by developing redundant systems, preserving essential knowledge across multiple institutions, and maintaining cultural traditions that support social cohesion during periods of crisis. The importance of maintaining technological and cultural knowledge outside centralized institutions becomes particularly apparent when examining how Bronze Age collapse eliminated essential capabilities that required centuries to redevelop. The disappearance of linear B literacy, palace administrative techniques, and sophisticated craft traditions demonstrates how institutional collapse can eliminate accumulated human achievements where knowledge remains concentrated in vulnerable centres. Modern societies can address this vulnerability by ensuring that essential technological and cultural knowledge remains distributed across multiple institutions and communities that can preserve and transmit crucial capabilities even during periods of political and economic disruption. The Bronze Age collapse ultimately demonstrates both the fragility and resilience of human civilization, revealing how sophisticated societies can disappear rapidly, while also showing how human communities can adapt to catastrophic change and create new forms of organisation that prove superior to their predecessors. The palace economies that dominated the Late Bronze Age represented remarkable achievements in political organisation, economic coordination, and cultural development. But their collapse enabled innovations in writing, political participation, religious thought, and technological development that would not have emerged within existing institutional frameworks. This historical experience suggests that while civilizational collapse represents genuine tragedy involving enormous human suffering and cultural loss, it can also create opportunities for fundamental innovations that advance human development in unexpected directions. The enduring significance of Bronze Age collapse lies not in its demonstration of civilizational vulnerability, but in its revelation of human adaptability and creative potential when faced with existential challenges. The societies that emerged from this crisis developed political institutions, cultural traditions, and technological capabilities that proved more resilient and adaptable than their Bronze Age predecessors, creating foundations for subsequent civilizational achievements that continue to influence contemporary life. Understanding this historical transformation provides essential perspectives for addressing modern challenges while maintaining confidence in human capacity for adaptation and innovation, even during periods of fundamental change.